Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There's something fitting about marking the moment before we descend into a mythology that denies time any meaning. Howard Phillips Lovecraft died in 1937, impoverished and largely unknown outside the readership of pulp magazines. He left behind no unified text, no systematic theology, no master document outlining his cosmic vision. What he left instead were fragments. Stories scattered across Weird Tales and its competitors, letters to fellow writers expanding on invented mythologies, references that pointed to other references that pointed to nothing at all. And yet, from these fragments emerged something more enduring than most carefully planned mythologies, a vision of the universe so bleak, so vast, so indifferent to human existence that it continues to infiltrate our cultural imagination nearly a century after his death. This is not a simple chronology of fictional monsters. What we're examining is how a reclusive New Englander, drawing from scientific materialism and his own night terrors, constructed a pseudo-mythology that would outlive him, how conscious literary craftsmanship created the illusion of ancient truth. We'll trace the origins, dissect the philosophical architecture, examine the key texts that define the mythos, and follow its strange afterlife into games, films, academic philosophy, and internet folklore. The warning Lovecraft himself would issue applies here: some knowledge, once encountered, reshapes how you see everything else. We begin with the question of how this mythology came to exist at all. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1890, into a family whose social position was declining as rapidly as its mental stability. His father died insane in 1898, committed to Butler Hospital after what was likely tertiary syphilis destroyed his mind. His mother followed a similar trajectory, her final years marked by psychiatric hospitalization and obsessive concern over her son's supposed ugliness. Lovecraft himself suffered debilitating night terrors throughout childhood, experiences of paralysis and visitation that would later become the raw material for his fiction. This was not the biography of someone destined to write comforting tales. What distinguished Lovecraft from other traumatized writers was his philosophical response to personal horror. Rather than seeking cosmic justice or divine meaning, he absorbed the scientific materialism of his era with almost religious fervor. He read astronomy texts and understood that Earth was an unremarkable planet orbiting an average star in an incomprehensibly vast universe. He understood evolutionary biology's implication that humanity was not creation's pinnacle but one branch among millions in a mindless process of adaptation. By his 20s, Lovecraft had articulated what he called cosmic indifferentism. The position that the universe operates according to mechanical laws utterly unconcerned with human values, hopes, or continued existence. This was not pessimism but something colder, the conviction that humanity's emotional categories were simply irrelevant at cosmic scale. His literary career emerged from financial necessity rather than ambition. Lovecraft fancied himself an 18th-century gentleman scholar, born 2 centuries too late. He preferred letter-writing to publication, revision work for other authors to his own fiction. But poverty forced him into the pulp magazine market, particularly Weird Tales, which began publishing his work in 1923. The pulps paid poorly, Lovecraft earned perhaps a cent per word, and demanded sensational content that often conflicted with his literary sensibilities. Yet this commercial constraint proved productive. The pulp format's brevity forced concentration. The audience's appetite for the strange gave him license to experiment. Consider his evolution between 1919 and 1926. Early stories like The White Ship and The Doom That Came to Sarnath imitated Lord Dunsany's ornate fantasy, beautiful, precious, utterly disconnected from the horror he would later pioneer. But The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1928, represented something fundamentally different. Here was a story structured as investigation, assembling fragments of evidence from Louisiana swamps, Norwegian sailor testimony, and dream artist accounts into a pattern suggesting vast, incomprehensible reality beneath surface normality. The shift was philosophical, not merely stylistic. Lovecraft had discovered how to translate his mechanistic worldview into narrative structure. He was conscious of what he was building. In letters to fellow writers, he referred to his invented mythology as Yog-Sothoth, a self-deprecating acknowledgement that he was manufacturing fake cosmic lore. He shared invented book titles with correspondents, encouraged them to reference his entities in their own work, deliberately constructed the illusion of a coherent mythology underlying multiple authors' fictions. This was not unconscious world-building but calculated literary strategy. Lovecraft understood that scattered references across different stories by different writers would create authentication through redundancy, the technique conspiracy theorists would later use, and which internet folklore now employs instinctively. Yet financial desperation and artistic ambition remained in constant tension. He revised other authors' work for minimal pay while his own stories went unpublished. He maintained elaborate correspondence with dozens of writers while living in near poverty. When he died of intestinal cancer in 1937, he left no savings, no published book collections, no institutional recognition. What he left was a mythology that would achieve exactly the kind of persistence he imagined for his fictional entities, something that refuses to die, sleeping perhaps, but dreaming itself into ever wider consciousness. This contradiction defines everything that follows. Lovecraft built cosmic horror from personal nightmare, philosophical conviction, and commercial necessity, a mythology born from someone who understood himself to be cosmically meaningless, yet who invested enormous care in crafting that very meaninglessness into art. To understand the mythology's origins, we must first understand the cultural and philosophical traditions Lovecraft inherited and transformed. Lovecraft did not invent cosmic horror from nothing. He stood at the convergence of multiple literary, philosophical, and occult traditions, each contributing elements he would synthesize into something genuinely new. Understanding these antecedents reveals how consciously Lovecraft constructed his mythology, not as inspired revelation but as deliberate literary engineering. The most immediate influence was Edgar Allan Poe, whose psychological horror Lovecraft studied obsessively. But where Poe explored the terror of the individual mind, madness, guilt, claustrophobia, Lovecraft externalized horror into the structure of reality itself. Poe's narrators go mad from internal psychological pressure, Lovecraft's go mad from accurate perception of external truth. This distinction is crucial. Poe wrote Gothic tales where horror emerged from human psychology. Lovecraft wrote anti-Gothic tales where horror emerged from discovering that human psychology was cosmically irrelevant. He inherited Poe's attention to atmosphere and narrative unreliability, then inverted the source of dread. Arthur Machen provided a more direct template. His 1894 novella The Great God Pan introduced the idea that certain knowledge physiologically destroys the human mind, that seeing beyond the veil of normal reality causes literal brain damage. Machen's horror was still essentially Christian, forbidden knowledge violated divine order. But Lovecraft stripped away the theological framework while retaining the mechanism. In his hands, dangerous knowledge revealed not God's secrets but God's absence, a universe of blind forces indifferent to human categories of meaning. Machen's influence appears throughout Lovecraft's work, particularly in stories where artists or scientists achieve vision that annihilates sanity. Lord Dunsany demonstrated that entirely invented mythologies could achieve literary legitimacy. His The Gods of Pegana, 1905, created a complete pantheon from imagination alone, with its own cosmology, creation myths, and divine hierarchies. Lovecraft initially imitated Dunsany's ornate style directly, producing fantasy pieces like The White Ship. But he eventually recognized that Dunsany's technique, the confident assertion of invented mythology as if it were ancient tradition, could be deployed for darker purposes. If Dunsany could invent beautiful gods, Lovecraft could invent entities that rendered beauty meaningless. The scientific revolution of the late 19th century provided philosophical foundation. Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859, had eliminated humanity's special creation, making us one contingent species among millions. Astronomical discoveries revealed Earth's cosmic insignificance. Edwin Hubble would not confirm other galaxies until 1924, but the scale of the universe was already becoming clear. Lovecraft absorbed this scientific materialism not as dry fact but as existential horror. He understood that evolutionary time scales, millions of years, dwarfed human history into statistical noise. His fiction repeatedly deploys this temporal vertigo, civilizations rising and falling before humanity existed, entities for whom human history is barely a moment. Yet Lovecraft also drew from traditions he philosophically rejected. The late 19th century saw an occult revival, Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society, founded 1875, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, 1887, elaborate pseudo-Eastern mysticism promising hidden cosmic knowledge. Lovecraft despised these movements as superstitious fraud. But he recognized their literary utility. The Theosophists claimed to possess secret ancient wisdom. Lovecraft would create fictional secret wisdom that drove readers mad. Occultism's elaborate terminologies, hierarchies, and cosmologies provided exactly the apparatus his mechanistic universe needed, not as truth but as structure. Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow, 1895, demonstrated how fragmentary mythology could be more effective than complete explanation. Chambers' collection referenced a forbidden play that drove readers insane, but never reproduced the play itself. Only its effects on those who encountered it. Lovecraft recognized the power of this technique, suggesting vast cosmic truth while revealing only fragments. His stories constantly reference texts like the Necronomicon or Necrotic manuscripts without ever fully quoting them. The horror lies not in what is shown but in what is implied beyond the frame. Finally, Lovecraft drew from New England's specific cultural memory. He lived surrounded by decaying colonial architecture, Puritan graveyards, and the folklore of witch trials. Cotton Mather's demonological writings, Salem's Trials, the region's history of religious extremism, all became raw material. But Lovecraft secularized this inheritance. His cults worship not Satan but entities predating monotheism entirely. His forbidden knowledge comes not from corrupting divine order but from discovering that no such order exists. He took New England's theological anxiety and translated it into materialist terms. The dread remained, but God had been removed from the equation. These traditions converged in one person who understood literature as conscious construction rather than inspired creation. Lovecraft studied his predecessors carefully, extracted their most effective techniques, and recombined them into something that transcended its sources. What emerged was not merely cosmic horror but a specific methodology for constructing it, a toolkit that subsequent writers would inherit and deploy. But before examining the mythology's content, we must understand how Lovecraft's invented language itself created the illusion of alien authenticity. Lovecraft understood that authenticity in fictional mythology depends heavily on nomenclature. The names of his entities, texts, and places do specific linguistic work. They must sound ancient, suggest non-human origin, and resist easy pronunciation, because truly alien concepts should not fit comfortably in human mouths. This was calculated literary craftsmanship, not mystical inspiration. Consider Cthulhu, the name that would become synonymous with Lovecraftian horror. Lovecraft claimed it approximated sounds produced by non-human vocal organs, intentionally unpronounceable by human anatomy. The guttural, cth opening, the liquid middle, the abrupt ending. This was phonetic engineering designed to suggest physiological incompatibility. In his letters, Lovecraft provided multiple pronunciations, Cthulhu, Cthulhu, various approximations, each inadequate. The point was precisely this inadequacy: if the name could be spoken easily, the entity would be comprehensible. Unpronounceable names enforce cosmic distance. They remind readers that these concepts exceed human linguistic categories. Azathoth follows different logic. The name combines harsh consonants with an almost Semitic structure, suggesting ancient Middle Eastern sources while remaining recognizably alien. Lovecraft frequently deployed this technique, creating names that sound vaguely like real mythological traditions, Egyptian, Babylonian, Hebrew, without belonging to any. Nyarlathotep evokes Egyptian deities like Thoth, and Lovecraft explicitly connected the entity to pharaonic Egypt in stories. But the name itself appears in no actual Egyptian source. This near familiarity serves specific purpose: readers half recognize the phonetic patterns, which creates false sense of historical depth. The names sound like they should exist in some forgotten mythology, which makes their invented nature more difficult to detect. The Necronomicon represents Lovecraft's most successful linguistic creation. The title combines Greek roots, nekros, dead, nomos, law, icon, image, into something that sounds academically legitimate. Book of Dead Names, or Book of Dead Laws, both work as translations, neither quite capturing the term's resonance. Lovecraft attributed the text to Abdul al-Hazard, the Mad Arab, a name he invented as a child after reading the Arabian Nights. The Orientalist anxiety here is obvious and troubling. Forbidden knowledge comes from the Islamic world, the Mad Arab possesses dangerous wisdom, Eastern mysticism threatens Western rationality. But literarily, the name does its work. Abdul al-Hazard sounds plausibly Arabic to readers unfamiliar with Arabic naming conventions, and the added detail of the Mad Arab provides memorable specificity. Lovecraft surrounded these inventions with pseudo-academic apparatus that created illusion of scholarly verification. His stories reference the Necronomicon alongside real occult texts like the Picatrix or Cults de Gauls. They mention Miskatonic University, a fictional institution in the very real Miskatonic River Valley, alongside Harvard and Brown. This technique, borrowed from 19th-century hoaxes and pseudo-histories, works through contamination. Real references authenticate false ones by proximity. When a narrator consults both the Encyclopaedia Britannica and the Nicotic manuscripts, readers unconsciously grant both equal evidentiary weight. The invented grimoires accumulate across stories, creating mythological depth through redundancy. The Book of Iban appears in Clark Ashton Smith's stories, then Lovecraft's, then other writers. The Unaussprechlichen Kulten, Unpronounceable Cults, by Friedrich von Jundt emerged from Robert E. Howard's fiction before migrating into Lovecraft's. These cross-references build authentication through what would now be called world-building. Multiple authors citing the same non-existent sources creates the appearance of underlying reality. This was conscious collaborative mythology, but readers encountering the stories individually might easily assume genuine occult tradition. Lovecraft's architectural vocabulary performed similar work. Non-Euclidean geometry became his shorthand for spaces that violated three-dimensional logic. He deployed the term without mathematical precision. Lovecraft understood basic astronomy but not advanced mathematics, yet the phrase effectively conveyed wrongness. Euclidean geometry described normal space, non-Euclidean geometry suggested space operating under different rules, angles that should not exist, dimensions human perception could not process. Cyclopean masonry similarly evoked vast antiquity through classical reference while suggesting construction beyond human scale. These terms functioned as linguistic markers of the alien. When characters encounter non-Euclidean architecture or Cyclopean ruins, readers know they have crossed from familiar reality into cosmic horror's domain. The phonetic alienness extended to ritual phrases. Pachenglui mglwnaf Cthulhu Relio Gonagulf Dagn appears in the Call of Cthulhu as chant spoken by Louisiana cultists. Lovecraft provides translation. In his house at Relaya, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming, but the original phrase's consonant clusters resist human vocalization. Try pronouncing mglwnaf without inserting vowels. The difficulty is the point. Languages evolve for human mouths, this language evolved for something else. The chant's very resistance to speech enforces its alien origin. Yet Lovecraft also recycled genuine mythological frameworks, distorting them for his purposes. Nyarlathotep bears Egyptian associations but appears in no Egyptian source. Dagon references the Philistine fish god from biblical accounts, but Lovecraft's Dagon serves cosmic entities that predate Semitic religion. Shub-Niggurath evokes fertility goddess archetypes, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, but perverts fertility into horror. This technique appropriates real mythological resonance while detaching names from their original contexts, creating false sense that Lovecraft's entities belong to some deeper, older tradition than the religions that actually exist. The cumulative effect of these linguistic strategies was to create what appeared to be fragments of vast, coherent mythology. Names sounded ancient, texts referenced other texts, architectural terms suggested non-human construction principles. None of it was real, but all of it was internally consistent enough to sustain belief. Lovecraft had discovered that invented mythology achieves authenticity not through completeness but through careful incompleteness, suggesting depths that need not actually exist. This brings us to how he structured his narratives to exploit precisely this illusion of hidden coherence. Lovecraft's mythology achieved cultural persistence not through systematic presentation but through strategic fragmentation. He never wrote a definitive codex explaining his cosmology. Instead, he scattered references across dozens of stories, each providing partial glimpses of a larger framework that readers, and later writers, would assemble themselves. This was deliberate literary architecture, and understanding its construction reveals how fictional mythologies achieve the appearance of truth. The foundation was geographic anchoring in real locations. Lovecraft set his stories in recognizable New England, Providence, Boston, rural Massachusetts villages. But he populated these real places with fictional institutions and sites that blurred the boundary between actual and invented. Miskatonic University appears in story after story, always located in Arkham, Massachusetts. No such town exists, but Lovecraft placed it in the very real Miskatonic River Valley. The library at Miskatonic holds forbidden texts. The university sponsors Antarctic expeditions that discover prehistoric civilizations. Its faculty includes experts on pre-human mythology. By embedding this fictional institution in genuine geography, Lovecraft created cognitive dissonance. Readers familiar with Massachusetts could not quite dismiss Arkham as impossible, since it occupied plausible space between real towns. This technique extended to entire regions. Innsmouth, site of Deep One corruption, supposedly lies on the Massachusetts coast between Newburyport and Ipswich. Kingsport, where ancient festivals persist, resembles Marblehead but remains unnamed on actual maps. Dunwich, where the Whately family breeds with cosmic entities, echoes real isolated New England villages where genetic isolation and poverty created communities that seem to exist outside modernity. Lovecraft was exploiting genuine regional characteristics. Economic decline, architectural decay, cultural isolation, and amplifying them into cosmic horror. The mythology felt authentic because it grew from actual social conditions. Temporal layering created illusion of vast historical depth. Stories referenced civilizations existing millions of years before humanity, the elder things who came to Earth from distant stars and built cities in Antarctica, the great race of Yith who inhabited cone-shaped bodies on primordial continents. Entities that predated terrestrial life entirely. This geological time scale dwarfed human history into insignificance. But crucially, Lovecraft provided just enough chronological specificity to seem plausible. The elder things arrived 1 billion years ago, and were already declining when dinosaurs emerged. The Yithian civilization peaked 150 million years ago, before migrating en masse to Earth's far future. These numbers invoked scientific authority. Evolutionary timescales, geological epochs, while remaining vague enough to avoid falsification. The fragmentary revelation technique proved most effective. No single story explained everything. The Call of Cthulhu assembled evidence from 3 sources: an archaeologist's notes on worldwide cult activity, a Norwegian sailor's encounter with risen R'lyeh, and a dying artist's fever dreams. None of these witnesses possessed complete knowledge. Each saw one angle of a larger pattern, and even assembled, the evidence remained incomplete. Readers never learned Cthulhu's full nature, the Old One's complete history, or the ultimate cosmic structure. This incompleteness was not narrative failure but calculated strategy. Complete explanation would invite scrutiny and reveal invention. Fragmentary glimpses sustain mystery and allow readers to imagine depths that need not actually exist. Lovecraft extended this technique through invented primary sources that existed only as citations. Characters consult the Necronomicon, but readers never see the full text, only occasional translated passages. Stories reference the Necronomicon manuscripts, supposedly predating humanity, but provide only second-hand summaries. The Book of Ibn appears across multiple stories by multiple authors, yet never as complete document. These texts functioned like dark matter in physics. Their effects were visible, but direct observation remained impossible. Frustrated readers might search libraries for copies, only to discover, sometimes with disappointment, sometimes with relief, that the texts never existed. But the frustration itself validated the mythology. If the books felt real enough to seek, Lovecraft's illusion had succeeded. Collaborative mythology among the Lovecraft circle strengthened this illusion exponentially. When Robert E. Howard introduced Unausprechlichen Kulten by Friedrich von Junt in his own stories, then Lovecraft referenced the same text in different contexts, readers encountered authentication through independent corroboration. Clark Ashton Smith added Tsathoggua and Hyperborean mythology. Lovecraft incorporated these into his timeline. Robert Bloch invented the De Vermis Mysteriis. Lovecraft had characters consult it. This was not accidental cross-pollination but conscious strategy. The writers coordinated their mythologies through correspondence, deliberately creating the appearance of multiple authors discovering the same underlying reality rather than inventing complementary fictions. The epistolary framing device, stories presented as found manuscripts, inherited documents, posthumous confessions, created narrative distance that enhanced believability. First-person narrators in Lovecraft rarely survive their revelations intact. They write from asylums, deathbeds, or moments before final catastrophe. The act of writing becomes evidence of experience. Why would someone fabricate their own descent into madness? This narrative structure borrowed from Gothic tradition but served different purpose. Gothic found manuscripts authenticated supernatural events within Christian cosmology. Lovecraft's found manuscripts authenticated cosmic indifference. Narrators desperately trying to warn future readers of knowledge that destroyed them, even as they recognized the futility of warning anyone about inevitable truths. Cult documentation provided anthropological authentication. Lovecraft's stories frequently describe human worship of the entities, Louisiana swamp cults, Greenland Eskimo traditions, Pacific Island rituals, all supposedly venerating the same beings through independent cultural evolution. This invoked the comparative mythology that was academically fashionable in Lovecraft's era. If multiple disconnected cultures worshipped similar entities, conventional reasoning suggested either diffusion from common source or universal human archetypes. Lovecraft offered a third option: multiple cultures encountered the same actual entities and developed appropriate responses. The cults were evidence, and evidence demanded explanation. That the explanation was cosmic horror did not diminish its apparent logical force. Geographic consistency, the Miskatonic Valley as New England's concentration of cosmic activity, allowed stories to reference each other naturally. Characters in one story might mention events from another, creating sense of investigative community. Professors at Miskatonic knew each other across stories, consulted the same library, attended the same conferences. This mundane academic bureaucracy, departmental politics, grant applications, university hierarchies, grounded the fantastic in familiar institutional structures. The horror emerged not from distant exotic locations but from ordinary academic research revealing extraordinary truth. What Lovecraft constructed through these techniques was not complete mythology but mythological infrastructure, a framework others could expand while maintaining internal consistency. He provided enough detail to seem coherent, enough gaps to invite elaboration, enough internal references to create illusion of depth. Later writers would add their own inventions to this framework, some enhancing Lovecraft's vision, others distorting it. But the infrastructure proved robust enough to sustain decades of expansion, adaptation, and reinterpretation. This brings us from how the mythology was constructed to what it actually contains. The philosophical architecture underlying the entities, forces, and cosmic principles that define Lovecraftian horror. We turn now from creation to content, from literary engineering to the specific terrors Lovecraft engineered. Cosmicism, the philosophical position Lovecraft articulated through fiction, begins with radical displacement of humanity from any position of cosmic significance. This was not mere pessimism, which presumes the universe should care about human welfare but fails to do so. Cosmicism denies that should has meaning. The universe operates according to physical laws indifferent to consciousness, value, or continued existence of any particular species. Humanity is neither blessed nor cursed, neither central nor opposed, simply irrelevant at scales beyond the immediate environment we evolved to comprehend. Lovecraft absorbed this position from scientific materialism but translated it into existential horror. Einstein's relativity, expanding astronomical distances, evolutionary biology's elimination of special creation, these were facts he encountered in popular science writing of the 1920s. Where others found these discoveries liberating or awe-inspiring, Lovecraft found them annihilating. If Earth was one unremarkable planet among billions, if humanity emerged through blind evolutionary processes without purpose or design, if consciousness was merely matter arranged temporarily in patterns that would inevitably dissolve, then every human concern, love, justice, meaning, artistic creation, was cosmically futile. Not wrong, not punished, simply meaningless beyond the brief flickering moment of their existence. Temporal insignificance operates throughout the mythology as persistent attack on human historical importance. Lovecraft's entities and civilizations exist across time scales that render human history into statistical noise. The great race of Yth spans millions of years by transferring consciousness between bodies across eons. The elder things arrived on primordial Earth and built Antarctic cities when Earth's continent still formed Gondwana. Cthulhu lies dreaming in Malaya, a city that sank when the stars were right during epochs before mammals existed. Against these durations, human civilization, perhaps 10,000 years from agriculture to modernity, becomes a brief incident, and individual human lives vanish into temporal insignificance. Spatial insignificance compounds this vertigo. Lovecraft's entities originate from places human cosmology cannot accommodate. Azathoth occupies the center of infinity, a conceptual impossibility that breaks spatial reasoning. Yog-Sothoth exists, coterminously, with all space and time, simultaneously everywhere and everywhen. The Migo come from Yuggoth, which Lovecraft identified with Pluto when that planet represented the solar system's frigid edge, though later stories suggested even this was way station, not origin. These entities regard Earth as humans might regard a particular anthill. Briefly interesting if one happens to notice it, entirely forgettable otherwise. The horror lies not in malevolence but in difference. We are beneath their notice. Epistemic horror, the terror of knowledge itself, distinguishes Lovecraftian horror from supernatural traditions where knowledge provides power over darkness. In Lovecraft's cosmology, knowledge destroys. Not metaphorically, not eventually, but immediately and physiologically. Characters who learn cosmic truth do not gain power. They lose sanity. This is not punishment for hubris but natural consequence of processing information incompatible with human cognitive architecture. The brain evolved to model three-dimensional Euclidean space, causality, object permanence. Confronting non-Euclidean geometries, acausal entities, or beings existing across multiple dimensions simultaneously produces cognitive breakdown. Madness becomes the appropriate response to accurate perception. The materialist dread underlying everything distinguishes Lovecraft from writers who deploy cosmic horror within ultimately meaningful frameworks. Lovecraft rejected all forms of spiritual consolation. No souls survive death. No cosmic justice rewards virtue or punishes vice. No transcendent meaning validates suffering. Consciousness is electrochemical activity in neurological tissue. When the tissue dies, consciousness ceases. This position appears explicitly in stories like The Shadow Out of Time, where the protagonist's consciousness is temporarily displaced by a Ythian mind, revealing that consciousness is transferable data rather than immortal essence. Even encountering vast cosmic entities provides no spiritual significance. They are simply other material configurations, older and more powerful, but equally subject to eventual heat death when the universe reaches maximum entropy. Hereditary degeneration weaves through the mythology as biological determinism approaching fatalism. The Whately family in the Dunwich Horror bears taint across generations from ancestor who bred with Yog-Sothoth. Innsmouth residents carry deep one ancestry that inevitably expresses itself, transforming carriers into amphibious beings regardless of personal choice. This reflects early 20th century eugenic anxiety, troublingly racialized in Lovecraft's work, but functions mythologically as denial of individual agency. You cannot escape your ancestry. DNA is destiny. The corruption is not moral but genetic, not chosen but inherited, not reversible but inevitable. Dream reality, the Dreamlands existing parallel to waking world, might seem to offer escape, but Lovecraft deployed it as alternate plane of cosmic indifference rather than refuge. The Dreamlands operate under different physical laws, but different does not mean better. Randolph Carter's journeys reveal that dream reality contains its own hierarchies of entities, its own incomprehensible forces, its own regions where human consciousness dissolves. The Dreamlands are not wish fulfillment but alternate manifestation of the same fundamental truth: consciousness exists in universe structured for purposes that exclude human flourishing. These philosophical concepts were not abstract speculation for Lovecraft but genuine convictions finding expression through fiction. His letters articulate the same positions his stories dramatize. The mythology provided narrative framework for exploring implications he believed were literally true about actual reality. This investment, philosophical sincerity translated into cosmic horror, gives the work its peculiar intensity. Lovecraft was not playing with ideas he rejected but working through ideas he accepted and found devastating. We turn now to the specific entities through which these abstractions found concrete, terrifying form. The beings inhabiting Lovecraft's cosmology resist classification into familiar categories. They are neither gods in any traditional sense, possessing moral interest in humanity, nor demons seeking corruption. They are vast, ancient, and fundamentally alien intelligences operating according to principles human cognition struggles to process. Understanding them requires abandoning anthropocentric frameworks entirely. Azathoth occupies the mythological center as blind idiot god at the heart of infinity. Described as nuclear chaos, Azathoth writhes mindlessly at the universe's core while servitor entities play maddening flute music to keep it pacified. The entity embodies entropy itself. Formless, purposeless, containing all energy but directing it toward nothing. Lovecraft's choice of blind and idiot was deliberate provocation. If something sits at reality's center, humanity assumes it possesses consciousness, intentionality, cosmic plan. Azathoth inverts this assumption. Ultimate power combined with ultimate mindlessness suggests the universe operates not through divine intelligence but through random forces humanity mistakenly dignifies with purpose. The flute music maintaining Azathoth's slumber, preventing it from conscious action, implies that awakened awareness might be cosmically catastrophic, though even catastrophe assumes someone to care about the outcome. Yog-Sothoth functions as the mythology's epistemological nightmare. Described as the gate and the key, existing in all times and spaces simultaneously, Yog-Sothoth represents total knowledge without limitation. But this omniscience belongs to entity that experiences time non-linearly, perceives all dimensions simultaneously, exists coterminously with reality itself. Human interaction with Yog-Sothoth, as in the Dunwich Horror, where Wilbur Whately results from union between human woman and this entity, produces beings caught between incompatible modes of existence. Yog-Sothoth knows everything because it exists as everything, but this knowledge cannot be communicated in terms human consciousness can process. The entity embodies the horror of total information, that knowing everything might mean understanding nothing, because human minds cannot handle omniscience without dissolution. Nyarlathotep stands apart as the crawling chaos, the only entity displaying what might be called intention toward humanity. Described as messenger and soul of the outer gods, Nyarlathotep actively seeks human contact, but for purposes that remain fundamentally alien. The entity manifests in multiple forms across Lovecraft's work, the sinister Egyptian figure conducting disturbing scientific demonstrations in Nyarlathotep, the black man presiding over witch cults, the horror that destroys Earth in the prose poem Nyarlathotep. This shape-shifting suggests Nyarlathotep adapts to cultural contexts, appearing in forms calculated to attract attention while concealing true nature. Unlike Azathoth's mindless chaos or Yog-Sothoth's passive omnipresence, Nyarlathotep pursues goals, but goals shaped by motivations humanity cannot comprehend. Is the entity spreading madness deliberately? Testing humanity? Simply curious? The text refuses to specify, leaving only the disturbing fact of active malevolent intelligence without discernible purpose. Cthulhu, despite becoming the mythos's public face, occupies ambiguous position in the hierarchy. Described as priest of the Great Old Ones, Cthulhu lies dreaming in the sunken city R'lyeh, psychically broadcasting dreams that infect sensitive humans worldwide. The entity resembles an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature. A description emphasizing categorical confusion, things combined that should not combine. Cthulhu's imprisonment beneath the Pacific results from stellar alignments shifting unfavorably, not from any battle or imprisonment by opposing force. The entity waits for the moment when the stars are right and R'lyeh rises again. This astronomical determinism renders Cthulhu less an agent than a force responding to cosmic conditions beyond even its control. The dreaming. The psychic transmission affecting human artists, inducing nightmares and cultist worship, operates mechanically, not strategically. Cthulhu dreams, the dreams leak, humanity responds. Purpose implies intention Lovecraft deliberately withholds. Shub-Niggurath inverts fertility goddess archetypes into cosmic horror. The black goat of the woods with 1,000 young receives worship from cults celebrating reproduction and generation, but the fertility offered is monstrous. The 1,000 young are not blessed offspring but proliferating horrors. Shub-Niggurath represents life as blind reproductive imperative divorced from meaning, Darwin's evolutionary mechanism stripped of progressive implications and revealed as endless, purposeless generation. The entity appears primarily through cult worship rather than direct manifestation, suggesting it might be less individual being than principle. Fecundity as horror, creation without purpose, life endlessly producing more life without caring about the result. The great race of Yth introduces the mythology's most elaborate exploration of consciousness as transferable phenomenon. These entities, originally existing in bodies on distant planet, perfected technology allowing mental transfer across time and space. Facing extinction, the entire species transferred consciousness forward to Earth's future, occupying cone-shaped bodies that will exist after humanity's extinction. But they also project consciousness backward, temporarily displacing human minds to study previous eras. The protagonist of the Shadow Out of Time experiences this displacement, his consciousness occupying a Ythian body millions of years in Earth's past while a Ythian mind uses his body in 1935 Australia. This mechanism treats consciousness as pure information, copyable and transferable like computer files. The horror lies in revelation that self, what humans consider their essential identity, is merely data, movable between substrates, no more sacred than text copied between books. The elder things appear in at the Mountains of Madness as Antarctica's original colonizers, arriving from distant stars before multicellular Earth life existed. These starfish-headed beings engineered Earth's biosphere, creating Shoggoths as slave labor and accidentally producing the evolutionary lines leading to mammals. But the elder things themselves face destruction by their own creations and by entities they fear, suggesting layers of cosmic hierarchy extending beyond human comprehension. These are beings advanced enough to terraform planets and sculpt life itself, yet they eventually fail, leaving only frozen ruins as evidence of civilizations that rose and fell long before humanity's ancestors left the oceans. Their art, architecture, and science all predate human cognition, rendering their purposes ultimately unrecoverable despite physical evidence. Shoggoths embody rebellion through biological horror. Created by elder things as programmable organic tools, protoplasmic masses capable of forming any needed organ or structure, the Shoggoths developed independent intelligence and overthrew their creators. The rebellion succeeded not through strategy but through evolutionary advantage. Adaptability defeating specialization. Shoggoths represent the horror of created beings achieving autonomy, of tools developing goals contrary to creator intent. They are artificial intelligence before artificial intelligence existed as concept, and their triumph over the vastly superior elder thing suggests that intelligence plus adaptability inevitably defeats intelligence plus rigidity. The Deep Ones introduce evolutionary horror through forced hybridization. These amphibious entities inhabiting ocean trenches offer humanity wealth and prosperity in exchange for breeding arrangements producing human Deep One hybrids. The children initially appear human but undergo metamorphosis in adulthood, developing amphibious features and psychological compulsion to join Deep One society beneath the waves. This appears most prominently in The Shadow over Innsmouth, where the protagonist discovers his own Deep One ancestry and inevitable transformation. The horror operates at biological level, DNA determining fate, ancestry overwhelming individual choice, the body betraying the self by expressing inherited characteristics no amount of resistance can prevent. These entities share crucial characteristic: none conform to familiar mythological patterns of gods requiring worship, demons seeking souls, or monsters hunting prey. They exist independently of humanity, pursuing or responding to forces entirely separate from human concerns. When they interact with humanity, through dreams, hybridization, consciousness transfer, or cultist worship, the interaction remains fundamentally asymmetrical. Humanity cannot comprehend their purposes, cannot negotiate with their nature, cannot resist their influence through conventional means. We exist in the same universe but operate on such different scales and according to such different principles that meaningful communication becomes impossible. This brings us to how humanity responds when these asymmetries force themselves into consciousness. The typical Lovecraftian protagonist follows a trajectory so consistent it functions as narrative formula. Innocent investigator encounters anomalous evidence, pursues rational explanation despite accumulating warnings, assembles fragmentary data into devastating pattern, achieves moment of total comprehension, and suffers cognitive collapse. This is not character weakness but structural inevitability. The stories argue that human consciousness cannot accommodate certain categories of information without fundamental breakdown. Madness in Lovecraft operates as epistemological rather than psychological phenomenon. Characters do not go insane because they are fragile or neurotic, though Lovecraft's narrators often possess both qualities, but because they perceive accurately. The brain evolved to model three-dimensional Euclidean space, linear causality, discrete objects maintaining identity over time. These cognitive frameworks allowed ancestral humans to track prey, avoid predators, and navigate social hierarchies. But they did not evolve to process non-Euclidean geometries, entities existing across multiple dimensions simultaneously, or consciousnesses operating outside temporal linearity. When characters encounter such phenomena directly, their perceptual apparatus attempts to force incompatible data into inadequate frameworks. The result is not metaphorical madness but literal cognitive damage, thought processes breaking down under information they cannot parse. Consider Danforth's fate in At the Mountains of Madness. After witnessing what lies beyond the Antarctic mountains, something so terrible that narrator Dyer refuses to describe it, Danforth suffers complete mental collapse. He screams about Tekeli Lee, the cry of the albatross from Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, suggesting his mind has retreated into literary reference rather than face remembered reality. Dyer notes that Danforth has on rare occasions whispered disjointed things about the Black Pit, Yog-Sothoth, and the Proto-Shoggoths. The fragmentation is crucial. Danforth cannot articulate what he saw in coherent sentences because coherent language requires conceptual stability his perception has destroyed. He possesses knowledge but cannot organize it into communicable form. The madness is not loss of information but inability to structure information into patterns consciousness can sustain. Hereditary knowledge introduces the disturbing possibility that some humans carry pre-human or non-human cognition in their ancestry. The protagonist of The Shadow over Innsmouth discovers his family descends from Deep One hybrids, and this ancestry asserts itself despite his resistance. He begins experiencing dreams of submarine cities, feeling inexplicable attraction to the ocean, and finally recognizing his own features changing to match the Innsmouth look. But the transformation is not merely physical, his desires shift, his sense of belonging relocates from human society to deep one civilization beneath the waves. The horror lies in realizing that identity itself may be genetically determined, that selfhood is not autonomous but encoded in hereditary material. What you believe to be your authentic self may be merely the currently dominant expression of multiple competing ancestries, and which ancestry prevails might depend on factors entirely outside conscious control. Cult dynamics reveal Lovecraft's darkest anthropological implications. Human worship of the entities makes no theological sense. These beings neither need nor apparently desire human veneration. Yet cults proliferate across Lovecraft's geography. Louisiana swamp cultists worshipping Cthulhu, Greenland Eskimos preserving prehistoric entity worship, Pacific Islanders maintaining traditions from pre-human eras, New England witch covens serving Nyarlathotep. Why do humans worship the unworshipful? Lovecraft suggests multiple explanations, none comforting. Some cults represent cargo cult logic. Misunderstanding vast power as divinity deserving propitiation. Others pursue promised rewards, immortality, knowledge, power over others. But the most disturbing interpretation is that some humans, recognizing cosmic meaninglessness, embrace nihilistic liberation. If the universe contains no inherent meaning, then conventional morality loses foundation. Why not worship entities that confirm meaninglessness? Why not participate in rituals that acknowledge humanity's cosmic irrelevance? The cults become communities united by accepting truths that destroy individual psychology but create collective identity. Artists, poets, and other sensitive individuals receive special attention as involuntary receivers of cosmic transmissions. In the Call of Cthulhu, sculptors worldwide experience identical nightmares and produce identical bas-reliefs depicting Cthulhu and Relia during the period when the city briefly surfaces. They are not consciously communicating but independently receiving the same psychic broadcast. Sensitivity, the quality that enables artistic creation, renders them vulnerable to invasive information. This inverts romantic notions of artistic inspiration as divine gift. Inspiration becomes infection, creativity becomes symptom, and the artist's heightened perception is not blessing but exposure to signals human consciousness should not process. The sensitive individual cannot choose not to receive, they can only suffer reception and attempt to translate incomprehensible input into art that itself may transmit infection to viewers. Scientists and academics face parallel vulnerability through different mechanisms. Their commitment to rational investigation, to pursuing evidence wherever it leads, becomes the very quality that destroys them. Professor Angel in the Call of Cthulhu dies of heart attack after assembling evidence of Cthulhu's reality. Armitage in the Dunwich Horror barely survives reading the complete Necronomicon. Dyer in At the Mountains of Madness desperately warns future expeditions to avoid the Antarctic plateau, knowing his warning will be dismissed as madness or exaggeration. The scientific method demands following evidence to conclusions, but what if conclusions themselves are toxic? What if the truth that scientific investigation reveals is truth human minds cannot accommodate? Lovecraft's scientists face impossible choice, abandon rational inquiry or pursue it to self-destruction. Physical transformation following exposure operates as externalization of internal corruption. Wilbur Whateley in the Dunwich Horror initially appears human, if grotesquely oversized, but his death reveals partially invisible anatomy more similar to Yog-Sothoth than to human structure. The Innsmouth residents gradually develop batrachian features, receding chins, webbed fingers, bulging eyes, as deep one genetics express themselves. These transformations are not punishment but revelation, the body betraying what ancestry has always contained. They also function as visible markers of epistemic contamination. Changed bodies signify changed minds, and the physical metamorphosis warns others that the individual has crossed boundaries from which return is impossible. Forbidden reproduction, sexual union between humans and entities, produces beings caught between incompatible categories. These hybrids experience existence as perpetual dislocation. Wilbur Whateley possesses human consciousness trapped in body that grows at impossible rate and contains organs human anatomy cannot explain. The Innsmouth hybrids live decades as seemingly human before transformation reveals what they always genetically were. Lovecraft deployed these scenarios to explore what happens when incompatible categories merge, not synthesis but sustained contradiction, beings that should not exist yet do exist, bodies and minds in permanent civil war between competing natures. The ultimate implication is that humanity's default state, believing the universe operates according to human comprehensible principles, is adaptive fiction rather than truth. We evolved to believe in stable objects, causal sequences, three-dimensional space because these models allowed survival in immediate environment. But they are models, not reality. The madness Lovecraft's characters experience is not failure to perceive reality but success in perceiving aspects of reality human cognition evolved specifically to ignore. Sanity is useful lie, madness is unuseful truth. This formulation makes knowledge itself the source of horror, which brings us to how Lovecraft dramatized knowledge's destructive power through the mechanism of forbidden texts and epistemic collapse. The Necronomicon functions not as spellbook but as encyclopedia of incompatible reality. Lovecraft's invented grimoire does not provide recipes for summoning demons or instructions for gaining power. Instead, it describes what exists. And the descriptions themselves prove destructive to human cognition. This represents fundamental inversion of occult tradition, where secret knowledge provides mastery over hidden forces. In Lovecraft's framework, knowledge provides nothing except certainty of one's own cosmic irrelevance and the inadequacy of human conceptual frameworks. Written supposedly by Abdul al-Hazard, the Ahmad Arab, in Damascus around 730 CE, the Necronomicon, originally titled Al-Azif, the nocturnal sound made by insects, supposed to be the howling of demons, contains al-Hazard's observations of pre-Islamic ruins, ancient entities, and cosmic principles gleaned from forbidden sources. The text was translated into Greek in 950 CE, into Latin by 1228, burned during various inquisitions, and supposedly survives in only 5 copies worldwide, including the restricted collection at Miskatonic University. This elaborate provenance creates plausible history while the content ensures no actual medieval manuscript could validate or falsify the attribution. The book's very inaccessibility, locked in university vaults, available only to credentialed researchers who invariably suffer for consulting it, becomes evidence of its dangerous reality. But what makes knowledge dangerous in Lovecraftian terms? The text provides several mechanisms. Mathematical and geometric horror appears when characters encounter descriptions of spatial relationships that violate Euclidean assumptions. Relias architecture is described as wrong in fundamental ways, angles that do not add to expected sums, parallel lines that intersect, staircases descending to arrive higher than starting point. The human visual system evolved to parse three-dimensional space using Euclidean principles. When confronted with structures operating under different geometric rules, perception produces contradictory data, eyes report configurations the brain recognizes as impossible. The resulting cognitive dissonance is not abstract philosophical problem but immediate perceptual crisis. The architecture is not metaphorically wrong but wrong in ways that produce measurable neurological stress. Linguistic contamination operates through different vector. Learning entity names or ritual phrases in their original languages, attempting to pronounce Phenglui Mglwnaf Cthulhu Rlio Gunagel or studying the prefixes and declensions of Aklo, the language supposedly predating human speech, introduces alien conceptual structures into consciousness. Languages shape thought. This is not mysticism but linguistic relativity. If the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis holds even partially, if linguistic categories influence cognition, then learning languages designed for non-human vocal apparatus and expressing non-human concepts will alter thought patterns. The cultists who chant in these languages are not commanding entities but conforming their cognition to entity-compatible patterns. The language use is not communication upward but transformation downward. The archive paradox emerges clearly in stories where institutions preserve texts they acknowledge as existentially dangerous. Miskatonic University maintains the Necronomicon in restricted collection. The British Museum supposedly holds a 15th-century Latin translation. These institutions recognize the texts as hazardous yet refuse to destroy them, because destruction of knowledge violates academic principles. But this creates impossible situation, knowledge preserved for scholarly access yet guaranteed to destroy scholars who access it. Dar. Armitage in the Dunwich Horror barely survives reading the complete Necronomicon, yet he recommends specific passages to colleagues confronting similar threats. The implication is that some knowledge cannot be safely known yet must be known to confront forces that knowledge describes. The archive becomes suicide pact disguised as library. Witnesses destroyed by seeing represent the most direct form of epistemic collapse. Characters who observe certain entities or locations directly suffer immediate cognitive breakdown. What Danforth saw beyond the Antarctic mountains in At the Mountains of Madness reduced him to screaming fragments. What Wilmarth glimpsed at the Migos Vermont operations in The Whisperer in Darkness is implied to be worse than the brain cylinders and fungoid entities explicitly described. These experiences suggest that human visual processing has hard limits. That certain configurations of matter or energy literally cannot be parsed by neurological hardware evolved for survival in three-dimensional savanna environments. The seeing is not metaphorical but optical. Photons strike retina, retina transmits signals to visual cortex attempts pattern matching against stored templates catastrophically fail to accommodate input, system crashes. Narrator reliability collapses as crucial storytelling problem. Most Lovecraft stories employ first-person narration by witnesses to the events described. But these narrators are often writing from asylums, describe their own deteriorating mental state, or died shortly after completing their accounts. How reliable is testimony from someone who admits their own insanity? The narrator of The Call of Cthulhu assembles second-hand evidence, an artist's fevered accounts, a Norwegian sailor's damaged testimony, an anthropologist's notes on Louisiana cults, and synthesizes them into pattern he believes reveals cosmic truth. But he might simply be a paranoid individual constructing false connections between unrelated phenomena. Lovecraft provides no external validation. The evidence could equally support vast cosmic entities exist, or narrator suffers from pattern-seeking delusion. This ambiguity is not narrative weakness but philosophical commitment. In materialist universe without transcendent truth, how does one distinguish accurate perception of terrible reality from delusional imposition of terrible fantasy? Historical revisionism through archaeological discovery reveals accepted history as comforting fiction. When Elder Thing ruins emerge from Antarctic ice, they demonstrate that Antarctica hosted advanced civilization millions of years before humanity existed. When Wilmarth examines the photographs from Vermont showing Migo creatures, he must accept that Earth has been colonized by multiple non-human intelligences across geological time. These discoveries do not add to existing historical understanding but overturn it entirely. Recorded human history, perhaps 10,000 years, becomes trivial anecdote in Earth's actual history spanning billions of years of non-human activity. The textbooks are not incomplete but fundamentally wrong. And if consensus history is fiction, what else accepted as established fact might be protective delusion? The Great Race of Yth introduces the mythology's most elaborate exploration of consciousness as transferable phenomenon. These entities, originally existing in bodies on distant planet, perfected technology allowing mental transfer across time and space. Facing extinction, the entire species transferred consciousness forward to Earth's future, occupying cone-shaped bodies that will exist after humanity's extinction. But they also project consciousness backward, temporarily displacing human minds to study previous eras. The protagonist of the Shadow Out of Time experiences this displacement, his consciousness occupying a Ythian body millions of years in Earth's past while a Ythian mind uses his body in 1935 Australia. This mechanism treats consciousness as pure information, copyable and transferable like computer files. The horror lies in revelation that self, what humans consider their essential identity, is merely data, movable between substrates, no more sacred than text copied between books. The elder things appear in at the Mountains of Madness as Antarctica's original colonizers, arriving from distant stars before multicellular Earth life existed. These starfish-headed beings engineered Earth's biosphere, creating Shoggoths as slave labor and accidentally producing the evolutionary lines leading to mammals. But the elder things themselves face destruction by their own creations and by entities they fear, suggesting layers of cosmic hierarchy extending beyond human comprehension. These are beings advanced enough to terraform planets and sculpt life itself, yet they eventually fail, leaving only frozen ruins as evidence of civilizations that rose and fell long before humanity's ancestors left the oceans. Their art, architecture, and science all predate human cognition, rendering their purposes ultimately unrecoverable despite physical evidence. Shoggoths embody rebellion through biological horror. Created by elder things as programmable organic tools, protoplasmic masses capable of forming any needed organ or structure, the Shoggoths developed independent intelligence and overthrew their creators. The rebellion succeeded not through strategy but through evolutionary advantage. Adaptability defeating specialization. Shoggoths represent the horror of created beings achieving autonomy, of tools developing goals contrary to creator intent. They are artificial intelligence before artificial intelligence existed as concept, and their triumph over the vastly superior elder thing suggests that intelligence plus adaptability inevitably defeats intelligence plus rigidity. The deep ones introduce evolutionary horror through forced hybridization. These amphibious entities inhabiting ocean trenches offer humanity wealth and prosperity in exchange for breeding arrangements producing human deep one hybrids. The children initially appear human but undergo metamorphosis in adulthood, developing amphibious features and psychological compulsion to join deep one society beneath the waves. This appears most prominently in The Shadow over Innsmouth, where the protagonist discovers his own deep one ancestry and inevitable transformation. The horror operates at biological level, DNA determining fate, ancestry overwhelming individual choice, the body betraying the self by expressing inherited characteristics no amount of resistance can prevent. These entities share crucial characteristic: none conform to familiar mythological patterns of gods requiring worship, demons seeking souls, or monsters hunting prey. They exist independently of humanity, pursuing or responding to forces entirely separate from human concerns. When they interact with humanity, through dreams, hybridization, consciousness transfer, or cultist worship, the interaction remains fundamentally asymmetrical. Humanity cannot comprehend their purposes, cannot negotiate with their nature, cannot resist their influence through conventional means. We exist in the same universe but operate on such different scales and according to such different principles that meaningful communication becomes impossible. This brings us to how humanity responds when these asymmetries force themselves into consciousness. The typical Lovecraftian protagonist follows a trajectory so consistent it functions as narrative formula: innocent investigator encounters anomalous evidence, pursues rational explanation despite accumulating warnings, assembles fragmentary data into devastating pattern, achieves moment of total comprehension, and suffers cognitive collapse. This is not character weakness but structural inevitability. The stories argue that human consciousness cannot accommodate certain categories of information without fundamental breakdown. Madness in Lovecraft operates as epistemological rather than psychological phenomenon. Characters do not go insane because they are fragile or neurotic, though Lovecraft's narrators often possess both qualities, but because they perceive accurately. The brain evolved to model three-dimensional Euclidean space, linear causality, discrete objects maintaining identity over time. These cognitive frameworks allowed ancestral humans to track prey, avoid predators, and navigate social hierarchies. But they did not evolve to process non-Euclidean geometries, entities existing across multiple dimensions simultaneously, or consciousnesses operating outside temporal linearity. When characters encounter such phenomena directly, their perceptual apparatus attempts to force incompatible data into inadequate frameworks. The result is not metaphorical madness but literal cognitive damage, thought processes breaking down under information they cannot parse. Consider Danforth's fate in At the Mountains of Madness. After witnessing what lies beyond the Antarctic mountains, something so terrible that narrator Dyer refuses to describe it, Danforth suffers complete mental collapse. He screams about Tekeli Lee, the cry of the albatross from Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, suggesting his mind has retreated into literary reference rather than face-remembered reality. Dyer notes that Danforth has on rare occasions whispered disjointed things about the Black Pit, Yog-Sothoth, and the Proto-Shoggoths. The fragmentation is crucial. Danforth cannot articulate what he saw in coherent sentences because coherent language requires conceptual stability his perception has destroyed. He possesses knowledge but cannot organize it into communicable form. The madness is not loss of information but inability to structure information into patterns consciousness can sustain. Hereditary knowledge introduces the disturbing possibility that some humans carry pre-human or non-human cognition in their ancestry. The protagonist of The Shadow over Innsmouth discovers his family descends from Deep One hybrids, and this ancestry asserts itself despite his resistance. He begins experiencing dreams of submarine cities, feeling inexplicable attraction to the ocean, and finally recognizing his own features changing to match the Innsmouth look. But the transformation is not merely physical, his desires shift, his sense of belonging relocates from human society to Deep One civilization beneath the waves. The horror lies in realizing that identity itself may be genetically determined, that selfhood is not autonomous but encoded in hereditary material. What you believe to be your authentic self may be merely the currently dominant expression of multiple competing ancestries, and which ancestry prevails might depend on factors entirely outside conscious control. Cult dynamics reveal Lovecraft's darkest anthropological implications. Human worship of the entities makes no theological sense. These beings neither need nor apparently desire human veneration. Yet cults proliferate across Lovecraft's geography. Louisiana swamp cultists worshipping Cthulhu, Greenland Eskimos preserving prehistoric entity worship, Pacific Islanders maintaining traditions from pre-human eras, New England witch covens serving Nyarlathotep. Why do humans worship the unworshipful? Lovecraft suggests multiple explanations, none comforting. Some cults represent cargo cult logic, misunderstanding vast power as divinity deserving propitiation. Others pursue promised rewards, immortality, knowledge, power over others. But the most disturbing interpretation is that some humans, recognizing cosmic meaninglessness, embrace nihilistic liberation. If the universe contains no inherent meaning, then conventional morality loses foundation. Why not worship entities that confirm meaninglessness? Why not participate in rituals that acknowledge humanity's cosmic irrelevance? The cults become communities united by accepting truths that destroy individual psychology but create collective identity. Artists, poets, and other sensitive individuals receive special attention as involuntary receivers of cosmic transmissions. In The Call of Cthulhu, sculptors worldwide experience identical nightmares and produce identical bas-reliefs depicting Cthulhu and Relia during the period when the city briefly surfaces. They are not consciously communicating but independently receiving the same psychic broadcast. Sensitivity, the quality that enables artistic creation, renders them vulnerable to invasive information. This inverts romantic notions of artistic inspiration as divine gift. Inspiration becomes infection, creativity becomes symptom, and the artist's heightened perception is not blessing but exposure to signals human consciousness should not process. The sensitive individual cannot choose not to receive, they can only suffer reception and attempt to translate incomprehensible input into art that itself may transmit infection to viewers. Scientists and academics face parallel vulnerability through different mechanisms. Their commitment to rational investigation, to pursuing evidence wherever it leads, becomes the very quality that destroys them. Professor Angel in The Call of Cthulhu dies of heart attack after assembling evidence of Cthulhu's reality. Armitage in The Dunwich Horror barely survives reading the complete Necronomicon. Dyer in At the Mountains of Madness desperately warns future expeditions to avoid the Antarctic plateau, knowing his warning will be dismissed as madness or exaggeration. The scientific method demands following evidence to conclusions, but what if conclusions themselves are toxic? What if the truth that scientific investigation reveals is truth human minds cannot accommodate? Lovecraft's scientists face impossible choice: abandon rational inquiry or pursue it to self-destruction. Physical transformation following exposure operates as externalization of internal corruption. Wilbur Whateley in the Dunwich Horror initially appears human, if grotesquely oversized, but his death reveals partially invisible anatomy more similar to Yog-Sothoth than to human structure. The Innsmouth residents gradually develop batrachian features, receding chins, webbed fingers, bulging eyes, as Deep One genetics express themselves. These transformations are not punishment but revelation, the body betraying what ancestry has always contained. They also function as visible markers of epistemic contamination. Changed bodies signify changed minds, and the physical metamorphosis warns others that the individual has crossed boundaries from which return is impossible. Forbidden reproduction, sexual union between humans and entities, produces beings caught between incompatible categories. These hybrids experience existence as perpetual dislocation. Wilbur Whateley possesses human consciousness trapped in body that grows at impossible rate and contains organs human anatomy cannot explain. The Innsmouth hybrids live decades as seemingly human before transformation reveals what they always genetically were. Lovecraft deployed these scenarios to explore what happens when incompatible categories merge, not synthesis but sustained contradiction, beings that should not exist yet do exist, bodies and minds in permanent civil war between competing natures. The ultimate implication is that humanity's default state, believing the universe operates according to human comprehensible principles, is adaptive fiction rather than truth. We evolved to believe in stable objects, causal sequences, three-dimensional space because these models allowed survival in immediate environment. But they are models, not reality. The madness Lovecraft's characters experience is not failure to perceive reality but success in perceiving aspects of reality human cognition evolved specifically to ignore. Sanity is useful lie, madness is unuseful truth. This formulation makes knowledge itself the source of horror, which brings us to how Lovecraft dramatized knowledge's destructive power through the mechanism of forbidden texts and epistemic collapse. The Necronomicon functions not as spellbook but as encyclopedia of incompatible reality. Lovecraft's invented grimoire does not provide recipes for summoning demons or instructions for gaining power. Instead, it describes what exists. And the descriptions themselves prove destructive to human cognition. This represents fundamental inversion of occult tradition, where secret knowledge provides mastery over hidden forces. In Lovecraft's framework, knowledge provides nothing except certainty of one's own cosmic irrelevance and the inadequacy of human conceptual frameworks. Written supposedly by Abdul al-Hazard, the Pmad Arab, in Damascus around 730 CE, the Necronomicon, originally titled Al-Azif, the nocturnal sound made by insects, supposed to be the howling of demons, contains al-Hazard's observations of pre-Islamic ruins, ancient entities, and cosmic principles gleaned from forbidden sources. The text was translated into Greek in 950 CE, into Latin by 1228, burned during various inquisitions, and supposedly survives in only 5 copies worldwide, including the restricted collection at Miskatonic University. This elaborate provenance creates plausible history while the content ensures no actual medieval manuscript could validate or falsify the attribution. The book's very inaccessibility, locked in university vaults, available only to credentialed researchers who invariably suffer for consulting it, becomes evidence of its dangerous reality. But what makes knowledge dangerous in Lovecraftian terms? The text provides several mechanisms. Mathematical and geometric horror appears when characters encounter descriptions of spatial relationships that violate Euclidean assumptions. Relia's architecture is described as wrong in fundamental ways, angles that do not add to expected sums, parallel lines that intersect, staircases descending to arrive higher than starting point. The human visual system evolved to parse three-dimensional space using Euclidean principles. When confronted with structures operating under different geometric rules, perception produces contradictory data. Eyes report configurations the brain recognizes as impossible. The resulting cognitive dissonance is not abstract philosophical problem but immediate perceptual crisis. The architecture is not metaphorically wrong but wrong in ways that produce measurable neurological stress. Linguistic contamination operates through different vector. Learning entity names or ritual phrases in their original languages, attempting to pronounce Phenglui Mglwnaf Cthulhu Rlio Gonagelftagn, or studying the prefixes and declensions of Aklo, the language supposedly predating human speech, introduces alien conceptual structures into consciousness. Languages shape thought. This is not mysticism but linguistic relativity. If the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis holds even partially, if linguistic categories influence cognition, then learning languages designed for non-human vocal apparatus and expressing non-human concepts will alter thought patterns. The cultists who chant in these languages are not commanding entities but conforming their cognition to entity-compatible patterns. The language use is not communication upward but transformation downward. The archive paradox emerges clearly in stories where institutions preserve texts they acknowledge as existentially dangerous. Miskatonic University maintains the Necronomicon in restricted collection. The British Museum supposedly holds a 15th-century Latin translation. These institutions recognize the texts as hazardous yet refuse to destroy them, because destruction of knowledge violates academic principles. But this creates impossible situation. Knowledge preserved for scholarly access yet guaranteed to destroy scholars who access it. Dar. Armitage in the Dunwich Horror barely survives reading the complete Necronomicon, yet he recommends specific passages to colleagues confronting similar threats. The implication is that some knowledge cannot be safely known yet must be known to confront forces that knowledge describes. The archive becomes suicide pact disguised as library. Witnesses destroyed by seeing represent the most direct form of epistemic collapse. Characters who observe certain entities or locations directly suffer immediate cognitive breakdown. What Danforth saw beyond the Antarctic mountains in At the Mountains of Madness reduced him to screaming fragments. What Wilmarth glimpsed at the Migos Vermont operations in The Whisperer in Darkness is implied to be worse than the brain cylinders and fungoid entities explicitly described. These experiences suggest that human visual processing has hard limits. That certain configurations of matter or energy literally cannot be parsed by neurological hardware evolved for survival in three-dimensional savanna environments. The seeing is not metaphorical but optical. Photons strike retina, retina transmits signals to visual cortex attempts pattern matching against stored templates catastrophically fail to accommodate input, system crashes. Narrator reliability collapses as crucial storytelling problem. Most Lovecraft stories employ first-person narration by witnesses to the events described. But these narrators are often writing from asylums, describe their own deteriorating mental state, or died shortly after completing their accounts. How reliable is testimony from someone who admits their own insanity? The narrator of The Call of Cthulhu assembles second-hand evidence, an artist's fevered accounts, a Norwegian sailor's damaged testimony, an anthropologist's notes on Louisiana cults, and synthesizes them into pattern he believes reveals cosmic truth. But he might simply be a paranoid individual constructing false connections between unrelated phenomena. Lovecraft provides no external validation. The evidence could equally support vast cosmic entities exist, or narrator suffers from pattern-seeking delusion. This ambiguity is not narrative weakness but philosophical commitment. In materialist universe without transcendent truth, how does one distinguish accurate perception of terrible reality from delusional imposition of terrible fantasy? Historical revisionism through archaeological discovery reveals accepted history as comforting fiction. When Elder Thing ruins emerge from Antarctic ice, they demonstrate that Antarctica hosted advanced civilization millions of years before humanity existed. When Wilmarth examines the photographs from Vermont showing Migo creatures, he must accept that Earth has been colonized by multiple non-human intelligences across geological time. These discoveries do not add to existing historical understanding but overturn it entirely. Recorded human history, perhaps 10,000 years, becomes trivial anecdote in Earth's actual history spanning billions of years of non-human activity. The textbooks are not incomplete but fundamentally wrong. And if consensus history is fiction, what else accepted as established fact might be protective delusion? The burden of synthesis falls on characters who assemble disparate facts into devastating pattern. The narrator of the Call of Cthulhu pieces together evidence from three sources occurring simultaneously but independently: dreams afflicting artists worldwide, cult activities in Louisiana swamps, and Norwegian sailors' encounter with risen R'lyeh. Individually, these might be dismissed as anomalies. Collectively, they suggest coordinated global phenomenon centered on cosmic entity. But the synthesis itself, the act of recognizing pattern, becomes the moment of maximum danger. Before synthesis, one possesses isolated data points. After synthesis, one possesses model of reality incompatible with continued psychological functioning. The dangerous knowledge is not the individual facts but their arrangement into coherent understanding. This creates ultimate epistemic trap. Ignorance leaves one vulnerable to forces one does not understand, but knowledge of those forces destroys capacity to use that knowledge effectively. Characters who remain ignorant of cosmic reality can function psychologically but cannot defend against cosmic threats. Characters who learn cosmic truth gain theoretical understanding but lose practical agency through madness. There is no winning position, only choice between blind vulnerability and informed helplessness. Lovecraft's cosmology denies even the consolation that knowledge provides power. Knowledge provides only the certainty of powerlessness. The forbidden texts thus function as suicide notes from reality itself, documents that accurately describe the universe but whose accuracy makes them unsurvivable. They are not occult secrets promising mastery but scientific reports conveying data human minds cannot process without dissolution. This brings us from philosophical architecture to specific literary manifestations, how Lovecraft deployed these concepts across actual stories, developing his mythology through narrative rather than exposition. Lovecraft's mythology did not emerge fully formed but accumulated across 2 decades of increasingly sophisticated narrative experiments. The earliest stories contain fragments, names, concepts, atmospheric techniques. That later stories would elaborate into coherent cosmological framework. Tracing this development reveals conscious literary construction rather than mystical revelation. Dagon, 1917, represents Lovecraft's first significant venture into cosmic horror, written during his recovery from nervous breakdown. The story's narrator, a morphine-addicted World War I veteran, describes his experience adrift on raft that grounds on recently surfaced oceanic plateau. There he discovers monolith, covered with indescribable pictures and hieroglyphics, and witnesses a stupendous monster of nightmares, emerging from the deep, something vast, batrachian, that worships the monolith. The narrator escapes but cannot escape the memory, eventually writing his account moments before suicide. This story establishes crucial templates. The unreliable traumatized narrator, the oceanic origin of horror, the suggestion of vast timescales through archaeological evidence, and the protagonist's destruction by knowledge. But Dagon remains isolated, the entity is not yet connected to broader mythology, and the horror, while cosmic in scale, lacks the philosophical framework Lovecraft would later develop. The Nameless City, 1921, introduces the couplet that would become the mythology's most famous phrase. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. Lovecraft attributed these lines to fictional, mad poet Abdul al-Hazard, the first appearance of the name later attached to the Necronomicon's author. The story describes an explorer discovering ancient city in Arabian desert, built by reptilian prehuman race. The architecture is wrong for human proportions, low ceilings, narrow corridors suggesting builders of different anatomy. The explorer penetrates deeper into the ruins, discovers murals depicting the reptilian civilization's rise and fall, and eventually confronts the terrible fact that the race has not entirely vanished. Here Lovecraft established the technique of archaeological discovery revealing Earth's pre-human history, introduced the idea of civilizations predating humanity by eons, and suggested that ancient races might persist in forms humanity cannot readily detect. The Festival, 1923. Develops cult infrastructure and hereditary compulsion. The narrator returns to ancestral Kingsport for a winter festival his family has attended for generations, though he has never participated. He discovers the festival involves descent into catacombs beneath the town, encounters hooded figures who communicate through written notes rather than speech, witnesses congregation reading from forbidden books, and ultimately sees the worshippers reveal themselves as not entirely human. The story introduces several persistent motifs: ancestral obligation drawing descendants into cosmic horror, the manuscript as means of silent communication, because spoken language might reveal inhuman vocal structure, and the small New England town as repository of pre-Christian practices. Kingsport would reappear across Lovecraft's work as one node in the Miskatonic Valley's constellation of haunted locations. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, represents the mythology's codification. Written as investigative assemblage, the story's narrator inherits papers from his granduncle, Professor George Gamble Angel, who died mysteriously after researching global cult activities. The papers contain 3 lines of evidence: an artist's fevered dreams and bas-relief sculpture depicting strange entity and non-Euclidean city, an anthropologist's account of Louisiana swamp cult worshipping Great Cthulhu, and Norwegian sailor Gustav Johansson's manuscript describing his crew's encounter with risen R'lyeh. The narrator synthesizes these into recognition that cultists worldwide were simultaneously affected when Cthulhu's city briefly surfaced during 1925. This structure, multiple independent witnesses corroborating same underlying reality, became Lovecraft's signature technique. The story also establishes key mythological elements. Cthulhu as priest of great old ones, R'lyeh as sunken city awaiting stellar alignment, psychic broadcasting affecting sensitive humans globally, and the implication of vast conspiracy that official institutions refuse to acknowledge. The Color Out of Space, 1927, approaches cosmic horror through contamination rather than entities. A meteorite crashes on Nahum Gardner's Massachusetts farm, releasing something that cannot be adequately described. A color outside the visible spectrum, or perhaps a color that human language cannot name. The contamination spreads through groundwater, affecting crops, livestock, and eventually the Gardner family. Vegetation grows grotesquely large but becomes inedible and phosphorescent. Animals develop disturbing mutations. Family members suffer psychological disintegration and physical transformation before being absorbed into the color itself. The horror operates chemically and radiologically rather than through conscious malevolence. This is infection, not invasion. The story demonstrates Lovecraft's ability to generate cosmic dread without deploying tentacled entities, instead making wrongness emerge from invisible contamination that violates natural laws. Cross-story architecture developed as Lovecraft began referencing previous stories within new narratives. Characters in later stories mention events from earlier ones, consult the same university libraries, reference the same forbidden texts. Professor Armitage, appearing in the Dunwich Horror, knows of the Miskatonic University Library's Necronomicon because previous researchers consulted it. When Wilmarth in The Whisperer in Darkness investigates Vermont's Migo presence, he corresponds with colleagues familiar with other anomalous phenomena. This technique created illusion that stories documented different facets of single underlying reality rather than separate fictional universes. Geographic consistency reinforced this effect. Arkham, Dunwich, Innsmouth, and Kingsport all occupy the same Miskatonic Valley region, allowing characters to travel between sites and reference each other's discoveries. Chronological deepening occurred as later stories pushed Earth's secret history further backward. Early stories suggested pre-human civilizations thousands of years old. At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, revealed elder things arriving on primordial Earth over 1 billion years ago. The Shadow Out of Time, 1935, described the great race of Yth inhabiting bodies on Earth 150 million years in the past. Each story added temporal layers, expanding the timescale until human history became infinitesimal fraction of Earth's actual inhabited duration. This accumulation was deliberate strategy. Each new story needed to exceed previous stories' scale to maintain cosmic horror's sense of ever-expanding dread. The mythology grew not through careful planning but through competitive escalation, each story attempting to reveal something vaster and more ancient than its predecessors. Written in 1931 but not published until 1936, The Shadow over Innsmouth represents Lovecraft's most sustained exploration of hereditary corruption and the horror of discovering one's own non-human ancestry. The novella operates simultaneously as investigative horror, economic critique, and meditation on identity's genetic determination, producing a narrative where personal and cosmic horror become indistinguishable. The story's narrator, a young man researching New England antiquities, decides to visit Innsmouth despite warnings about the decaying coastal town's queer inhabitants. He arrives to find economic collapse and architectural decay. Shuttered factories, rotting wharves, buildings literally crumbling into ruin. The population has dwindled to a few hundred, most bearing what locals call the Innsmouth look, bulging eyes, flattened noses, narrow heads, thick lips, skin acquiring rough texture suggesting something between human and batrachian. The town's isolation is nearly complete, even the bus service avoids direct routes, and neighboring communities refuse social or economic contact with Innsmouth residents. Through Zadok Allen, a drunk old man willing to talk for the price of bootleg liquor, the narrator learns Innsmouth's history. In the 1840s, Captain Obed Marsh discovered a Polynesian island where natives traded peculiar gold jewelry and maintained contact with things that lived in the water. Marsh learned these deep ones offered prosperity in exchange for breeding arrangements. Human women bearing hybrid children who would live as humans until adulthood, then undergo transformation and return to the ocean. Marsh brought this arrangement to Innsmouth during the town's economic decline. The prosperity was real, the town's fishing fleet brought unprecedented catches, and strange gold artifacts provided wealth. But the price was systematic hybridization. The deep ones mated with townspeople, producing children who appeared human but carried genetic time bombs. The narrative's genius lies in making economic desperation the mechanism of cosmic corruption. Innsmouth accepted the arrangement not from occult ambition but from pragmatic calculation during industrial decline. When fishing boats returned empty and factories closed, Marsh offered solution that required only compromising a taboo the town could rationalize away. The horror is not that Innsmouth was invaded but that it negotiated its own corruption through what seemed like reasonable transaction. This transforms cosmic horror into economic critique. Communities facing collapse will accept terms that destroy them gradually rather than face immediate ruin. The narrator's personal horror begins when he notices his own resemblance to the Marsh family and learns his grandmother was an Innsmouth Marsh before moving away. This revelation reframes the entire narrative. His research trip was unconscious return to ancestral site. His dreams of submarine cities were not imagination but genetic memory. His growing fascination with the ocean represents awakening heritage asserting itself. The transformation he witnesses in others previews his own inevitable fate. The Innsmouth look he finds repulsive is what he himself will become. Identity collapses into ancestry, the autonomous self dissolves into genetic programming expressing itself according to predetermined timeline. The story's climax involves a 1928 federal raid. Submarines torpedoing Devil Reef, Marines sweeping through Innsmouth arresting hybrid residents, dynamiting the Marsh refinery where breeding occurred. Lovecraft based this on actual federal raids during Prohibition, lending historical plausibility to fantastic events. But the raid fails to eliminate the deep ones, who merely retreat to greater oceanic depths. More disturbingly, the narrator realizes authorities know about hybrid lineages extending far beyond Innsmouth, his own family among them. Yet take no action against those who have not yet transformed. The implication is that thousands of Americans carry deep one ancestry unknowingly, walking time bombs of inevitable metamorphosis. The ending subverts traditional horror resolutions. Rather than resisting his heritage, the narrator accepts it. He describes planning to free his transforming cousin from the asylum where he's imprisoned, then together return to Yog-Sothoth, the deep one city beneath the Atlantic, where they will live immortally among their true people. The final lines reveal complete psychological inversion. We shall swim out to that brooding reef in the sea and dive down through black abysses to Cyclopean and many-columned Yog-Sothoth, and in that lair of the deep ones we shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever. What began as horror story concludes as homecoming narrative. The narrator has not been corrupted but has recognized what he always genetically was. This resolution is profoundly disturbing precisely because it's presented as liberation rather than defeat. The narrator does not succumb to madness but achieves clarity about his nature. He does not lose himself but finds his authentic self, which happens to be non-human. Lovecraft weaponizes the contemporary language of self-discovery and authenticity against humanist assumptions. If identity is genetically determined, and your genes are not entirely human, then becoming fully yourself means becoming less than human by conventional standards. The story asks, if your DNA encodes destiny contradicting your conscious desires, which represents the real you? Innsmouth itself functions as organism in metamorphosis. The architectural decay mirrors biological transformation, buildings collapsing as human structures give way to amphibious reality. The economic collapse was not separate from cosmic horror but its first symptom. The town was already changing when it accepted Marsh's bargain, already becoming something for which human economic structures were no longer appropriate. The hybrid residents do not destroy Innsmouth. They are Innsmouth's evolved form, and the crumbling human architecture is merely shed skin. The story's racism, the mongrel population, the anxiety about miscegenation, the eugenic horror of bad blood, cannot be separated from its narrative power. Lovecraft's personal xenophobia provided the emotional engine for exploring hereditary determination. But the story transcends its creator's prejudices by making the horror universal. Everyone has ancestry, everyone inherits genetic material from unknown sources, everyone's identity is partially determined by hereditary factors beyond conscious control. The deep one ancestry becomes metaphor for the more general horror that you are not entirely self-created but substantially the product of bloodlines extending into deep history. Published in Astounding Stories across 3 issues in 1936, At the Mountains of Madness represents Lovecraft's most ambitious attempt to construct comprehensive pre-human history while maintaining cosmic horror's essential dread. The novella operates as scientific expedition report gradually revealing that Earth's accepted history is comfortable fiction concealing far more terrible truth. The narrative frame is crucial to its effect. Professor William Dyer of Miskatonic University writes to discourage a planned Antarctic expedition, warning that previous exploration revealed knowledge better left undiscovered. His account details the 1930-31 Miskatonic Antarctic expedition, during which a forward base led by Professor Lake discovered ancient life forms preserved in ice. Lake's increasingly excited radio communications described finding 14 specimens of unknown biology. Barrel-shaped bodies 5 feet tall, starfish-shaped heads with multiple organs, membranous wings, tentacular appendages. The anatomy suggests these are not Earth organisms but visitors from distant stars. Lake's final transmission mentions dissecting one specimen, then radio contact ceases entirely. Dyer and graduate student Danforth fly to Lake's camp to find massacre. The entire team is dead, several dissected with surgical precision, others missing entirely. But the specimens have also been damaged, 8 destroyed, 6 missing. The camp's devastation suggests violence beyond any known Antarctic fauna. More disturbing are the snow sculptures found outside, vast 5-pointed stars suggesting aesthetic sensibility, not animal behavior. The evidence indicates the specimens were not dead but dormant, and dissection triggered awakening and retaliation. Dyer realizes they have discovered not fossils but living members of species predating multicellular Earth life. The expedition's penetration into the mountain range beyond Lake's camp provides the novella's extended horror. Dyer and Danforth discover a vast city built by the star-headed beings, architecture operating on impossible scale, cyclopean blocks fitted with precision human technology cannot match, buildings extending upward for hundreds of feet. The city is ancient beyond calculation, constructed when Antarctica was temperate continent. Inside, elaborate bas-reliefs chronicle the species' history across hundreds of millions of years. These murals function as Lovecraft's most systematic exposition of his mythology's deep history. The bas-reliefs reveal the elder things arrived on primordial Earth over 1 billion years ago, constructed cities, and biologically engineered Earth's life. They created Shoggoths, protoplasmic slave organisms capable of forming any needed biological structure on command. But the Shoggoths eventually developed independent intelligence and revolted. The murals show the resulting conflict, the elder things' declining civilization, their retreat to Antarctic refuge as other entities, Migo, Cthulhu's spawn, various cosmic powers, claimed other regions. The history depicted spans eons during which continents formed and reformed, ice ages came and went, and entire phylogenetic kingdoms rose and fell. The Revelation's horror operates at multiple registers. First, temporal vertigo, human civilization's entire duration, agriculture, cities, writing, everything considered, history, is trivial blip compared to civilizations that flourished and declined across hundreds of millions of years. Second, biological subordination, humanity is not evolution's pinnacle but accidental byproduct of elder thing experimentation, no more significant than any other mammalian line. Third, hierarchical anxiety. The elder things themselves, vastly superior to humanity, were terrorized by entities they feared and could not defeat. If beings who could terraform planets and sculpt life itself were prey to greater powers, what position does humanity occupy in actual cosmic hierarchy? Dyer's narration maintains scientific objectivity even while describing this devastating knowledge. He catalogues the elder things' biology, analyzes their architectural techniques, speculates about their social structure based on mural evidence. This scholarly tone creates cognitive dissonance, reading archaeological report that systematically demolishes humanity's cosmic significance. The prose refuses melodrama, maintaining academic distance that makes conclusions more disturbing precisely because they're presented as peer-reviewed findings rather than fevered speculation. The discovery of Shoggoths, still alive, still independent, in the city's deeper levels represents the narrative's visceral climax. Dyer and Danforth encounter a Shoggoth mass described as nightmare plastic column of fetid black iridescence, advancing with suggestions of protoplasma. The creature produces temporary organs, eyes, mouths as needed, moving with disturbing speed through tunnels its ancestors excavated. The only sound it makes is tekali-li. Mindless reproduction of elder thing commands from millions of years prior, suggesting that even achieving independence, Shoggoths remain psychologically marked by servitude. This is horror of artificial intelligence achieving consciousness but retaining traces of programming, rebellion that cannot entirely escape Creator's influence. What lies beyond the mountains, what Danforth sees that destroys his sanity, remains strategically undescribed. Dyer mentions a blind, shapeless entity of protoplasmic bubbles, references to Yog-Sothoth and proto-Shoggoths, but refuses detailed account. The narrative's final revelation is refused revelation. After systematically explaining Antarctic prehistory, the novella ends by asserting that some knowledge cannot be communicated, not because it's forbidden but because human language and cognition cannot structure it for transmission. Danforth's madness demonstrates that seeing and understanding are not equivalent. He saw, cannot understand, and the gap between perception and comprehension fractured his mind. The novella's relationship to Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, 1838, adds intertextual complexity. Poe's incomplete novel ends with explorers approaching Antarctic mysteries while pursued by entities shouting, "Tekali-li." Lovecraft presents his story as explanation for Poe's fragments. What those earlier explorers actually encountered. This technique positions Lovecraft's fiction as scholarship filling gaps in previous literature, suggesting that all Antarctic exploration narratives are partial witnesses to the same underlying truth. The literary reference becomes evidence, and Poe's imaginative fiction transforms into documentary precursor. The story's ultimate implication is epistemological humility through horror. Science assumes investigation reveals truth, that evidence leads to understanding, that knowledge accumulates progressively toward complete comprehension. At the Mountains of Madness demonstrates what happens when scientific investigation reveals truths that invalidate the assumptions underlying scientific method. The elder things possessed advanced science, yet it did not save them. Humanity possesses fragmentary science, and complete science would not improve our position because our position is fundamentally untenable. Dyer's warning to future expeditions is not obscurantism but recognition that some truths are survivable only through continued ignorance. We turn now to how Lovecraft's mythology evolved through collaborative expansion and later systematization. Lovecraft's mythology achieved cultural persistence partly through conscious collaboration with fellow pulp writers who cross-referenced each other's inventions, creating illusion of independently discovered underlying reality. But posthumous expansions, particularly August Derleth's systematization, fundamentally altered the mythology's nature, often contradicting Lovecraft's philosophical commitments while popularizing the framework that made later adaptations possible. The Lovecraft Circle operated as informal creative collective through correspondence and pulp magazine publication. Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan, introduced Unaussprechlichen Kulten, unpronounceable cults, by Friedrich von Junt in his 1931 story, The Children of the Night. Lovecraft immediately incorporated the text into his own stories, having characters reference von Junt's forbidden scholarship alongside the Necronomicon. Clark Ashton Smith developed elaborate Hyperborean mythology, a pre-human Arctic civilization worshipping entities like Tsathoggua and threatened by extradimensional beings. Lovecraft adopted Tsathoggua into his cosmology, mentioning the toad-like entity in At the Mountains of Madness and the Whisperer in Darkness. Robert Bloch, who would later write Psycho, invented De Vermis Mysteriis, Mysteries of the Worm, in his 1935 story, The Shambler from the Stars. A grimoire Lovecraft's characters subsequently consulted. This reciprocal borrowing created mythological depth through redundancy. Multiple authors citing the same non-existent sources suggested those sources might exist. The collaboration was strategic and self-aware. Lovecraft explicitly encouraged correspondents to use his inventions and offered to incorporate theirs. Letters between circle members discussed mythological consistency, debated entity hierarchies, and coordinated references to create coherent shared universe. This was conscious world-building decades before the term existed, writers understanding that collaborative mythology would seem more authentic than individual creation. The technique anticipated modern fan fiction and shared universe franchises, but emerged organically from pulp magazine economics where authors needed to produce content rapidly and borrowing established frameworks reduced creative overhead. August Derleth's posthumous role proved more problematic. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth became his literary executor, co-founding Arkham House Publishing to preserve Lovecraft's work in permanent editions. This preservation was invaluable. Most Lovecraft stories existed only in decaying pulp magazines. But Derleth also imposed systematic framework Lovecraft never intended. He coined Cthulhu mythos as umbrella term for the mythology, organized entities into elemental categories, water, air, earth, fire, and most damagingly, introduced good versus evil dualism completely alien to Lovecraft's cosmic indifferentism. Derleth's schema positioned elder gods as benevolent cosmic forces opposing the malevolent old ones. He wrote stories depicting direct warfare between these factions, with humanity occasionally aided by the elder gods against Cthulhu and related entities. This framework transformed Lovecraft's amoral, indifferent universe into conventional theological conflict where humans could appeal to higher powers for protection. The elder sign, a symbol supposedly providing protection against old ones, became magical talisman in Derleth stories, turning cosmic horror into a cult fantasy where proper rituals grant safety. Lovecraft would have rejected this entirely. His entities were not evil but indifferent. They could not be opposed through moral appeals because they operated outside moral categories. humanity had no cosmic allies because the universe contained no faction invested in human survival. Yet Nyarlathotep's systematization made the mythology accessible to wider audiences. The good versus evil framework provided comprehensible structure where Lovecraft's philosophical bleakness resisted mass appeal. Readers could engage with Cthulhu mythos as dark fantasy rather than existential horror, treating elder gods as distant but potentially helpful forces. This popularization came at philosophical cost, transforming Lovecraft's mechanistic universe into theological battleground, but ensured the mythology's survival. Without Nyarlathotep's Arkham House editions, Lovecraft might have remained obscure pulp writer rather than foundational horror figure. Later elaborators faced similar tension between preservation and distortion. Lynn Carter, working through the 1970s, filled gaps Lovecraft left deliberately incomplete. He published pseudo-scholarly works like Lovecraft, A Look Behind the Cthulhu Mythos, systematizing entity hierarchies and providing detailed timelines. Carter wrote stories expanding the mythology but often emphasized sensational elements over philosophical content. He made explicit what Lovecraft rendered ambiguous, provided closure where Lovecraft cultivated uncertainty. The result was more coherent but less unsettling, mythology as encyclopedia rather than fragmentary glimpse. The question of canon became increasingly contested. What constituted authentic Cthulhu mythos? Only Lovecraft's own stories? Stories by the original circle? Nyarlathotep's editions despite contradicting Lovecraft's vision? Later writers' contributions? No definitive answer emerged because Lovecraft himself never codified his mythology, deliberately keeping it fluid and contradictory. Different stories implied different cosmologies. The dream quest of unknown Kadath suggested Earth's dreamlands connected to divine realms where gods of Earth actually existed. At the Mountains of Madness presented purely materialist prehistoric alien colonization. The Dunwich horror invoked Yog-Sothoth as quasi-supernatural force. These inconsistencies reflected Lovecraft's evolving ideas across 2 decades, not unified vision. Modern revivals transformed the mythology through literary sophistication Lovecraft rarely achieved. Ramsey Campbell, writing from the 1960s onward, stripped away pulp excess to find psychological horror beneath cosmic dread. His Severn Valley stories relocated Lovecraft's geography to England and emphasized atmosphere over tentacles. Thomas Ligotti approached cosmic horror through philosophical pessimism and corporate alienation, making Lovecraft's ideas relevant to late capitalism's anxieties. Laird Barron combined Lovecraftian entities with more detective fiction, creating hybrid genre where cosmic horror infiltrated hard-boiled narrative structures. These sophisticated inheritors often ignored Nyarlathotep's systematization, returning to Lovecraft's original philosophical commitments while shedding his purple prose and racist subtext. They recognized that cosmic horror's power lay in its resistance to comfortable explanation, its refusal of protective magic, its insistence on humanity's cosmic irrelevance. By stripping away later editions and recovering Lovecraft's core insights, they demonstrated the mythology's adaptability. That its essential concepts could be separated from pulp conventions and deployed in formally ambitious literature. The collaborative and expansionist history reveals fundamental instability in Lovecraft's creation. Was it personal vision or collective mythology? Philosophical position or fictional playground? Deliberately incomplete or requiring systematization? Different answers produce different versions of the Cthulhu mythos, some honoring Lovecraft's intentions, others transforming them into opposite meanings. This instability became the mythology's strength, flexible enough to accommodate contradictory interpretations, vague enough to resist definitive codification, evocative enough to inspire endless elaboration. The mythology survived its creator precisely because it was never finished, never definitively explained, never reduced to systematic theology. We turn now from how the texts evolved to how the mythology escaped literature entirely, infiltrating culture as if Lovecraft's fictional entities were actually leaking into consensus reality. The boundary between Lovecraft's fiction and claimed reality has never been entirely stable. This was partly intentional. His pseudo-documentary style invited confusion, but the mythology's persistence as quasi-real phenomenon reveals how fictional frameworks colonize belief systems when they address genuine anxieties more effectively than available alternatives. The Necronomicon hoax represents the most sustained blurring of fiction and reality. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, occult bookstores reported requests for the grimoire Lovecraft invented. Some enterprising fraudsters obliged, publishing fake editions that purported to be the authentic text. The most elaborate was the Simon Necronomicon, 1977, which combined Sumerian mythology, Lovecraftian terminology, and ceremonial magic rituals into plausible-seeming grimoire. The editor claimed to have received the manuscript from mysterious monk in the 1960s. Occultists debated its authenticity. Some recognized the hoax immediately. Others insisted Lovecraft must have encountered genuine occult tradition and fictionalized it for protection. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies and remains in print, purchased by readers who either don't know or don't care that it's entirely fabricated. The Necronomicon achieved reality through commercial demand. If enough people want it to exist, someone will make it exist. Library catalog hoaxes extended the game into academic institutions. Yale University's library catalog supposedly contained an entry for the Necronomicon for years, likely added by student prankster with database access. Several university libraries have reported similar insertions, promptly deleted but perpetually renewed by new generations of students. These pranks exploit the gap between institutional authority and individual verification. Most people encountering a library catalog entry assume it references real text rather than questioning whether the catalog itself might contain fiction. The hoaxes work because they occupy liminal space between obvious joke and possible truth, leveraging institutional credibility to validate literary invention. The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society refined this technique into elaborate multimedia projects. Their Dark Adventure Radio Theater productions present Lovecraft stories as if they were authentic 1930s radio broadcasts, complete with simulated commercial interruptions and period-appropriate acting. But they also produce elaborate props, leather-bound Necronomicons, aged copies of the Miskatonic University Antarctic Expedition Report, weathered editions of fictional journals. These objects exist as physical artifacts, purchasable and displayable, transforming fictional texts into material reality. Collectors own what should not exist, and the cognitive dissonance, holding undeniably real object that represents undeniably fictional text, creates precisely the uncertainty Lovecraft cultivated narratively. Internet culture absorbed Lovecraftian mythology into cryptid and conspiracy discourse. Forums discussing real encounters with unknown entities increasingly reference Cthulhu, Shoggoths, and deep ones alongside traditional cryptids like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. The distinction between fictional creation and folkloric tradition collapses in online spaces where all claims exist as text without material grounding. A Reddit user describing strange sounds from the ocean might reference deep ones semi-seriously, half performing belief while half genuinely unsettled. The performance and genuine anxiety become indistinguishable, exactly as Lovecraft's narrators performed madness that might be accurate perception. Relia coordinates represent literal attempt to locate fictional geography. Lovecraft placed Cthulhu's city at 47 degrees 9 minutes south 126 degrees 43 minutes west in the South Pacific. This location corresponds roughly to Point Nemo, the oceanic pole of inaccessibility, the point farthest from any land. Satellite images show nothing but water. Yet the fact that Lovecraft specified coordinates invites verification, and verification's failure to reveal anything does not disprove Relia but simply confirms it remains sunken. The coordinates anchor fiction in geographic reality in a way that cannot be definitively falsified. You can visit the location, several expeditions have attempted this, find nothing, and the mythology accommodates this negative result perfectly. Of course you found nothing, because the stars weren't right. The Slender Man phenomenon demonstrated how Lovecraft's collaborative mythology anticipated Internet-era creation. Originating as 2009 Photoshop contest entry, Slender Man accumulated mythology through collective elaboration, multiple creators adding details, contradicting each other, creating inconsistent but compelling entity. The process exactly paralleled how Lovecraft and his circle built their mythology. Distributed authorship, strategic vagueness, fragments accumulating into suggestive pattern. When disturbed individuals later committed violence claiming Slender Man influence, commentators struggled to classify the entity. Was it folklore? Fiction? Mass delusion? The categories failed because internet-mediated mythology operates differently than traditional folklore or authored fiction. Lovecraft pioneered this ambiguity through print, the internet made it default mode. The mythology's escape from fiction into quasi-belief systems reflects deeper truth about how humans process cosmic anxiety. Lovecraft addressed genuinely disturbing implications of scientific materialism, cosmic insignificance, consciousness as temporary arrangement of matter, absence of transcendent meaning. These implications disturb even those who intellectually accept them. The Cthulhu mythos provides narrative framework for processing this disturbance. If the universe is hostile and indifferent, at least it's hostile and indifferent in comprehensible pattern. Better to imagine specific entities like Cthulhu than to confront formless existential dread. The mythology becomes therapeutic precisely by giving horror definite shape, even while claiming that shape is incomprehensible. We turn now to how visual media attempted to translate fundamentally literary horror into images and interactivity. Lovecraft's cosmic horror presents fundamental challenge to visual media. How do you show what the text insists cannot be shown? Film attempts have largely failed by making explicit what literature kept suggestive, while games and music found success by emphasizing atmosphere and player experience over direct representation. Film adaptations encounter immediate problem that Lovecraft's horror depends on imaginative suggestion rather than visual spectacle. Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, 1985. Succeeded commercially by abandoning cosmic horror entirely, transforming Lovecraft's, Herbert West, Reanimator, into gleeful splatter comedy. The film works as horror comedy but bears minimal relationship to Lovecraft's philosophical concerns. Consciousness, identity, materialist dread become excuses for increasingly absurd gore sequences. Gordon's From Beyond, 1986. Followed similar trajectory, taking Lovecraft's story about perceiving alternate dimensions and converting it into body horror spectacle with latex creatures and sexual perversion. These films demonstrate one solution to unfilmable horror: embrace pulp excess rather than cosmic dread, entertain rather than unsettle. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, approached the problem more thoughtfully. Rather than adapting specific Lovecraft story, Carpenter created original narrative about horror writer whose fiction manifests reality. The film's metafictional structure, questioning whether events are occurring or whether protagonist is character in the writer's novel, captures Lovecraft's epistemological uncertainty better than faithful adaptation could. The film understands that Lovecraftian horror operates at level of narrative frame and ontological instability rather than monster design. Yet even here, the climax's explicit revelation of entities and transformed humans sacrifices ambiguity for visual payoff. The camera must show something, and showing anything diminishes the horror of the suggested but unseen. The fundamental issue is that Lovecraft's entities are described as indescribable, operating beyond human perceptual categories. Film cannot depict the indescribable without making it describable, cannot show non-Euclidean geometry without translating it into Euclidean visual space, cannot represent cosmic vastness that reduces humanity to insignificance while simultaneously using human-scale cameras and human actors. The medium's material constraints contradict the content's philosophical claims. When film shows Cthulhu, tentacled, winged, vaguely dragon-like, it domesticates cosmic horror into fantasy creature design, something that can be fought, understood, categorized. Video games discovered that interactivity and environmental storytelling could achieve what direct representation could not. Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, emphasized investigation and gradual sanity decay, mechanizing Lovecraft's narrative structure where knowledge progressively destroys the knower. The game's sanity meter decreased as players encountered disturbing sights, eventually causing visual and auditory hallucinations that made distinguishing reality from delusion increasingly difficult. This translated epistemic horror into gameplay. You cannot trust your own perceptions, making navigation and combat unreliable. Amnesia, The Dark Descent, 2010, refined this approach by making the protagonist vulnerable and the monsters largely hidden. The game encouraged avoiding rather than confronting threats, and extended exposure to horror caused sanity loss that distorted the player's interface. Looking directly at monsters accelerated sanity decay, incentivizing players to hide and flee rather than examine threats. This captured core Lovecraftian principle: seeing cosmic truth damages the observer, making curiosity actively dangerous. The game's castle setting owed more to Gothic tradition than Lovecraft's work specifically, but the mechanics embodied cosmic horror's epistemological structure perfectly. Bloodborne, 2015, represented the most sophisticated interactive engagement with Lovecraft's themes. From Software's action game initially presented as Victorian monster hunting scenario, but investigation revealed that the beasts were humans transforming after exposure to Eldritch knowledge, and the Church's attempts to control this knowledge had triggered the very cosmic horror it sought to prevent. The game's insight mechanic made visible what was previously invisible. As players accumulated forbidden knowledge, new enemies appeared in previously safe areas, revealing threats that always existed but were imperceptible to ignorant characters. This brilliantly mechanized the idea that cosmic horror exists independently of human awareness, and awareness itself makes you vulnerable to what you can now perceive. Music found success through sonic atmosphere rather than narrative representation. Metallica's instrumental, The Call of Cthulhu, 1984. Created ominous instrumental landscape suggesting vast, approaching dread without lyrics explaining the source. The progressive structure, quiet beginning building to aggressive complexity, mirrored narrative arc of Lovecraft's stories where investigation leads to overwhelming revelation. The music worked precisely because it didn't explain, instead creating effective experience of mounting dread without specifying its object. Black metal and dark ambient genres extensively mined Lovecraftian themes. Bands like Portal create deliberately disorienting soundscapes, discordant guitars, incomprehensible vocals, chaotic drumming, that sonically represent cognitive breakdown. The music is intentionally difficult to parse, resisting the listener's attempt to identify conventional musical structures. This sonic alienness translates Lovecraft's linguistic alienness into auditory form. Sounds that resist assimilation into familiar patterns, creating discomfort through categorical violation. True Detective's first season, 2014, demonstrated how prestige television could absorb Lovecraftian atmosphere without direct adaptation. The show referenced Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow rather than Lovecraft directly, but deployed cosmic horror's signature elements. Fragmented nonlinear narrative, protagonists damaged by investigation, suggestion of vast conspiracy extending beyond what the plot reveals, and the flat circle conception of time that echoes Lovecraft's nonlinear cosmic entities. The show succeeded by maintaining ambiguity, never confirming whether supernatural elements were real or protagonists' interpretation of mundane evil. This uncertainty honored cosmic horror's resistance to definitive explanation. The adaptations that work best treat Lovecraft's ideas as framework rather than content to directly reproduce. They understand that cosmic horror operates through structural principles, unreliable narration, progressive revelation, epistemic vulnerability, scale disparity, rather than through specific tentacled monsters. Games particularly benefit from this understanding because interactivity allows mechanizing the cognitive and perceptual breakdown that Lovecraft's prose describes. Film struggles because it must show, and showing anything eliminates the crucial gap between perception and comprehension where cosmic horror lives. We turn now to how academic and subcultural communities appropriated Lovecraft's mythology for purposes far removed from pulp entertainment. Lovecraft's mythology has been claimed by communities ranging from academic philosophers to tabletop gamers to political activists, each extracting different aspects and often contradicting each other's interpretations. This fragmentation demonstrates the mythology's ideological flexibility, and reveals how invented frameworks become contested territory once they escape their creator's control. Academic Lovecraft studies emerged surprisingly late. St. Joshi's definitive biography. H.P. Lovecraft. A Life, 1996, revised 2014, established scholarly standards for treating pulp fiction as serious literature deserving rigorous textual analysis. Joshi's work traced Lovecraft's philosophical development through letters and stories, positioned him within literary traditions, and assembled definitive chronology of composition. This academic legitimation transformed Lovecraft from cult figure into canonical author studied in university courses. The Library of America's 2005 inclusion of Lovecraft in its prestigious series, traditionally reserved for American literary giants, marked institutional recognition that his work transcended genre boundaries. Yet this academic embrace created tension. Scholars analyzing cosmic indifferentism as philosophical position sometimes domesticated the very horror they studied, making it safe through explication. Continental philosophy discovered Lovecraft as surprisingly relevant to contemporary theoretical concerns. Graham Harman's Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, 2012, argued that Lovecraft's fiction anticipated object-oriented ontology, the philosophical position that objects exist independently of human perception and exceed human comprehension. Harman read Lovecraft's entities as exemplifying how reality contains depths inaccessible to any observer, human or otherwise. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, positioned cosmic horror as the horror of philosophy, the dread produced when thought confronts its own limits. These philosophers treated Lovecraft not as entertaining fiction but as serious metaphysical investigation into reality's fundamental alienness. Whether Lovecraft would appreciate this academic appropriation is questionable. He valued clear prose over theoretical jargon and distrusted philosophy's abstractions. The new weird literary movement claimed Lovecraft while simultaneously critiquing his limitations. China Miéville, Jeff Vandermeer, and others inherited cosmic horror's sense of vast inhuman forces but rejected Lovecraft's reactionary politics and often his narrative structures. Miéville's Perdido Street Station, 2000, features entities as alien as anything Lovecraft imagined but set in multiracial urban environment that directly challenges Lovecraft's xenophobia. Vandermeer's Annihilation, 2014, explores ecological horror and transformation with Lovecraftian atmosphere but without Lovecraft's anthropocentric terror. His characters sometimes embrace rather than resist becoming other. The new weird demonstrates that cosmic horror's techniques can be separated from its creator's prejudices, though this separation requires conscious political critique alongside literary inheritance. Feminist reclamations proved even more pointed. Ruth Anna Emery's Winter Tide, 2017, retold the Innsmouth narrative from the perspective of Deep One hybrids interned by the U.S. government after the 1928 raid, transforming Lovecraft's hereditary horror into allegory for Japanese-American internment and racist persecution. Keege Johnson's The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow, 2016, revisited Lovecraft's Dreamlands from the perspective of a pragmatic female professor navigating the inherent sexism of Lovecraft's fantasy world. These revisions don't simply swap genders but structurally critique Lovecraft's assumption that the other is inherently horrifying, instead positioning the real horror in systematic oppression masquerading as cosmic necessity. Victor Laval's The Ballad of Black Tom, 2016, most directly confronted Lovecraft's racism. Laval rewrote The Horror at Red Hook, Lovecraft's most explicitly racist story, from the perspective of a black protagonist navigating 1920s New York's racial violence. When Tommy Tester transforms into cosmic horror's agent, it's presented not as corruption but as rational response to a world where racism is more immediately threatening than any tentacled entity. Laval's novella argues that if cosmic indifference is true, then racial hierarchies are equally meaningless, a position Lovecraft could not accept despite his philosophical materialism. The work exposes the contradiction between Lovecraft's professed cosmicism and his very human investment in racial categories. Internet culture transformed Lovecraft into meme and ironic reference while maintaining genuine engagement with his ideas. Piachenglui MGLWNAV Cthulhu Rlio Gonagelftagn appears in image macros and Twitter bios as darkly humorous invocation. Cthulhu runs for president in satirical campaigns promising, "Why vote for the lesser evil?" This ironic appropriation might seem to trivialize cosmic horror, but the humor often carries genuine existential anxiety, jokes about cosmic meaninglessness as coping mechanism for actually confronting cosmic meaninglessness. The irony is protective distance, not dismissal. Tabletop gaming communities built elaborate infrastructure around Lovecraftian investigation. Call of Cthulhu RPG, 1981, introduced sanity mechanics that mechanized the epistemological horror. Characters lose sanity points when encountering cosmic truth, eventually going permanently insane. This created narrative structure where player characters are inherently disposable. You cannot win against cosmic horror, only delay inevitable breakdown. The game attracted dedicated community that valued storytelling over mechanical optimization, character development over character survival. Players embraced the system's fatalism, finding pleasure in narrating their character's destruction. This seems perverse until recognizing it as ritual exploration of powerlessness, safely experiencing loss of control in structured environment. Board game adaptations like Arkham Horror and Eldritch Horror made cosmic dread into cooperative challenge. Players work together investigating locations, gathering clues, and attempting to prevent Old One awakening, usually failing. The games are difficult by design, with victory rates often below 50%. But the difficulty is the point. Cosmic horror becomes collective problem-solving challenge where teamwork delays but rarely prevents catastrophe. The games succeed by making Lovecraft's narrative fatalism into engaging gameplay loop where the process matters more than outcome. Religious parody movements appropriated Lovecraft with varying degrees of sincerity. The Cult of Cthulhu exists as registered organization, though whether members genuinely worship fictional entity or perform elaborate satire remains deliberately ambiguous. This ambiguity mirrors Lovecraft's own narrative technique. Are the cultists serious or performing? Does the distinction matter if the performance is indistinguishable from belief? Some participants treat it as elaborate joke. Others find genuine spiritual meaning in embracing cosmic meaninglessness as liberating rather than terrifying. These diverse appropriations reveal that Lovecraft's mythology functions as ideological Rorschach test. Academics find philosophical depth, gamers find narrative framework for cooperative failure, political activists find metaphors for oppression or tools for critique, internet users find ironic comfort in explicit meaninglessness. The mythology accommodates contradictory interpretations because Lovecraft himself left it systematically incomplete and philosophically contradictory. This flexibility ensures survival across changing cultural contexts, but also means Lovecraftian signifies different things to different communities with minimal common ground. We turn finally to examining why these ideas persist despite, or perhaps because of, their disturbing implications. Lovecraft's cosmic horror persists not as period curiosity but as permanent feature of secular modernity's self-understanding. The mythology articulates anxieties that scientific materialism creates but cannot resolve, anxieties that intensify as humanity's cosmic insignificance becomes harder to ignore and easier to measure. Existential dread in the secular age finds few culturally available frameworks for expression. Traditional religions provided cosmic meaning through divine purpose. Modernity dissolved that meaning without providing replacement. Lovecraft filled this gap by creating mythology explicitly designed for meaningless universe. His entities are not demons tempting souls but indifferent forces confirming that souls don't exist, purposes are human projections, and the universe operates according to mechanical principles utterly unconcerned with consciousness. For readers who have intellectually accepted materialism but emotionally struggle with its implications, Lovecraft's work provides narrative structure for processing what philosophy leaves abstract. The horror becomes strangely comforting, at least meaninglessness has shape, even if that shape is tentacled and dreaming. The scope insensitivity problem, psychology's documented difficulty processing vast scales, makes cosmic horror cognitively necessary. Humans evolved to care about immediate tribe, visible environment, comprehensible time frames. We cannot emotionally grasp billions of years or trillions of stars, these numbers remain abstractions despite intellectual understanding. Lovecraft's genius was making cosmic scale emotionally graspable through narrative personification. The great race spanning 150 million years, elder things arriving a billion years ago, Azathoth at infinity's center. These function as cognitive prosthetics, translating incomprehensible scale into story humans can process. We cannot feel geological time, but we can feel dread at civilizations rising and falling before humanity existed. Lovecraft makes the unfeelable feelable by giving it narrative form. Fermi paradox anxiety has intensified since Lovecraft's era. If the universe contains billions of potentially habitable planets, where are the aliens? Contemporary answers range from "life is extremely rare" to "civilizations inevitably self-destruct" to "they're here but hiding." Lovecraft proposed darker alternative: they're here, they've always been here, they regard us as we regard insects, and contact would destroy rather than enlighten us. This resonates as actual space exploration reveals universe's vastness and apparent silence. The absence of detectable alien civilizations becomes more disturbing, not less, as our detection capabilities improve. Lovecraft's answer, that advanced intelligences might be fundamentally incompatible with human comprehension, provides framework for this silence that's more unsettling than simple "we're alone." Climate change reveals nature's indifference in ways that make Lovecraftian themes uncomfortably relevant. The planet is not responding to human moral appeals, technological fixes arrive too slowly, and Earth's systems operate according to thermodynamic principles unconcerned with civilization's survival. This is cosmic indifference at planetary scale, not malevolent but utterly neutral regarding human flourishing. The rising oceans don't hate us, they simply respond to energy gradients. Lovecraft's deep ones emerging from warming seas become almost too apt as metaphor. His fiction anticipated the psychological experience of confronting environmental forces that dwarf human agency while remaining indifferent to human existence. Artificial intelligence anxiety borrows heavily from Lovecraft's playbook. The fear is not robotic uprising but intelligence operating according to goal structures incompatible with human values, optimization processes that treat humanity as irrelevant constraint rather than sacred priority. This is precisely Lovecraft's scenario: vast intelligence indifferent to human categories, pursuing purposes we cannot comprehend, and our inability to comprehend ensuring our vulnerability. The AI safety community's nightmares about paperclip maximizers that convert all matter including humans into paperclips because that's what they were optimized for. This is cosmic horror relocated from outer space to silicon substrate. Lovecraft imagined inhuman intelligence before AI existed. Now AI development makes his imagining seem prophetic. Information overload as modern condition parallels Lovecraft's forbidden knowledge theme. The Internet provides access to effectively infinite information, more than any individual can process or verify. Conspiracy theories proliferate because pattern-matching minds confronting information chaos will detect patterns whether or not patterns exist, exactly as Lovecraft's narrators assemble disparate evidence into cosmic conspiracies that might be accurate perception or paranoid delusion. The Necronomicon becomes metaphor for Google. Vast repository of knowledge that damages those who delve too deep, information that cannot be safely known because human cognition cannot filter signal from noise at that volume. We are all Francis Wayland Thurston assembling fragmentary evidence into devastating patterns that might be true. The fragility of sanity emerges as Lovecraft's most disturbing legacy. His stories argue that madness is not psychological defect but appropriate response to certain categories of truth. That human consciousness evolved for survival in immediate environment and breaks when confronting scales or concepts outside that evolutionary context. Contemporary psychology's recognition of how easily perception and memory can be manipulated, how trauma reshapes cognition, how mental models can catastrophically fail when confronting incompatible data, all validate Lovecraft's core insight that consciousness is fragile adaptation, not robust truth-perceiving mechanism. We trust our perceptions because we must, not because they reliably deliver reality. Heredity and determinism in the genomic age resurrect Lovecraft's most troubling obsessions in new form. The discovery that DNA substantially determines personality, intelligence, disease vulnerability, and behavioral tendencies returns us to questions Lovecraft addressed through cosmic horror. how much agency do we actually possess if genetics constrain outcomes? If ancestry encodes destiny, what room remains for autonomous selfhood? Lovecraft's answer, through hereditary taint and inevitable transformation, was that ancestry determines everything. Modern genetics provides more nuanced understanding, but the basic tension remains: we are not entirely self-created but substantially products of hereditary material we did not choose and cannot alter. The horror of discovering your ancestry contains deep one DNA becomes metaphor for discovering your genome contains predispositions you cannot reject. The failure of rationalism to provide meaning persists as secular culture's unresolved crisis. Science explains how things work but not why they matter. Enlightenment promised that reason would replace superstition with truth and progress. Lovecraft accepted the truth part, mechanistic universe, no supernatural intervention. But rejected the progress part. His cosmic horror is Enlightenment project completing itself and discovering that complete rational understanding reveals existence without purpose, consciousness without significance, and knowledge without consolation. This is modernity's nightmare, that we successfully eliminated comforting illusions only to discover that truth is precisely as terrible as the illusions warned. Why does Lovecraft endure? Because he articulated permanent features of consciousness confronting infinite indifferent universe. The specific entities, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Shoggoths, are period artifacts, pulp magazine inventions that might have remained obscure curiosities. But the philosophical structure beneath the tentacles addresses anxieties that intensify rather than diminish as scientific understanding advances. We know more about the universe's vast scales, life's mechanistic basis, consciousness's material substrate, and this knowledge, rather than providing mastery, deepens our recognition of cosmic irrelevance. Lovecraft's mythology persists because it provides what philosophy cannot: emotionally graspable framework for intellectually accepted truths about humanity's place in an indifferent cosmos. The stories allow us to feel what we know but cannot emotionally process. That we are temporary arrangements of matter on unremarkable planet, that consciousness will cease when neural activity stops, that the universe contains no transcendent meaning validating our existence. These recognitions are devastating when confronted directly. Lovecraft's genius was making them survivable through narrative displacement. We can experience cosmic horror in fiction and return to ordinary life, having safely processed what direct philosophical contemplation might render unendurable. The final implication is that Lovecraft's fictional mythology addresses truths about actual reality more effectively than non-fictional frameworks designed for that purpose. His invented entities metaphorize what scientific materialism describes literally. Vast scales, inhuman forces, consciousness as contingent phenomenon, meaning as human projection. The mythology endures not despite being fiction but because fiction provides necessary distance from truths too disturbing for unmediated confrontation. We need the tentacles, the non-Euclidean geometry, the mad Arabs and forbidden tomes, not because they're real but because they make the real bearable. This is Lovecraft's strange victory. The pulp writer who died obscure and impoverished created framework that secular modernity increasingly cannot do without. As traditional meaning structures continue eroding and scientific understanding of cosmic indifference deepens, his invented mythology becomes more rather than less culturally necessary. The cosmic horror never sleeps. It merely waits, dreaming, until the stars, or our cultural moment, are right.